Welcome back to the Quiet Apothecary. Take a slow breath, let your shoulders drop, and settle into wherever you happen to be tonight. There is nothing here that asks anything of you, and nowhere else you need to be for the next few hours. Tonight we do not walk out to a garden, or lift the latch of a stillroom, or sit at the counter of an apothecary shop while the jars catch the last of the light. Tonight we go instead into a library. Not a bright one, a shadowed room. Long after the reading candles have been snuffed and the copyists have gone to their beds, where the books stand close together on their shelves in the dark, and where a good many of them, if their pages could speak, would tell you how nearly they came to never reaching this shelf at all. For our subject tonight is the books that someone, somewhere, once wished were gone. The remedy books, the herbals and the Leechbooks, the receipts and the charms, the quiet plant medicine of ordinary people, written down in ink on skin and paper, and then, for one reason or another across the long centuries, condemned, corrected, hidden away, scattered, or burned. We will move through them slowly, gathering them a few at a time, the way you might take down one old volume after another from a high shelf and turn its pages by candlelight, in no hurry at all to reach the end. I should say, before we begin, that this is not a tale of villains. It is easy, from a distance of so many hundreds of years, to reach for outrage, and outrage has no place in this quiet room tonight. What we will find instead is something gentler, and I think, more interesting. A long, patient pull between forgetting and remembering, in which the remembering, more often than not, quietly won. Books saved by the very people who distrusted them. Old words kept alive inside new covers. Cures folded small and tucked into the places no one would think to look. There is no need to remember any of this. Let your attention drift wherever it likes. We have a great many hours ahead of us, and not one of these old books will mind in the least if you fall asleep somewhere among them. Let us begin where the story itself begins, with the books the Christian world did not write, but inherited. The plant medicine of medieval Europe did not spring up out of nothing. It rested, like a house upon old foundations, upon a great library it had received from a world that came before it. And that world was not Christian at all. It was the world of Greece and of Rome, of physicians who prayed to gods with quite different names, and their books came down into the cloisters and the copying rooms already ancient, already strange, carrying inside them a whole way of seeing, the living green world that the new faith would spend centuries learning how to hold. At the very heart of that inheritance stood one book above all others, written by a man named Pedanius Dioscorides. He was a Greek, born in Asia Minor, and he served, it is said, as a physician with the armies of Rome in the 1st century after Christ, though he can have known little and cared less about the small faith then spreading quietly through the eastern provinces. As he followed the legions from place to place, he gathered plants, questioned local healers, and set down everything he learned in 5 books that he called, in Greek, a work on the matter of medicine. We know it now by its Latin name, De Materia Medica, and it is not too much to say that it became the single most copied medical book in the whole of the Western world for the better part of 1500 years. What Dioscorides did was patient and enormous. He described some 600 plants and hundreds of remedies drawn from them, setting down for each one where it grew, how to know it, how to prepare it, and what it was good for. He wrote of the poppy and its sleep, of the willow and its bark, of the wound herbs and the fever herbs, and the roots that settled a sore stomach in a plain, careful voice that trusted what he had seen with his own eyes over what he had merely been told. For century after century, a physician who wished to know a plant reached first for Dioscorides, and the copyists who kept his book alive rarely dared to change a word of it. So great was the authority it had gathered to itself. And yet the book they were copying was, from root to crown, a pagan thing. Its plants were bound up with the old gods and the old rites, gathered under certain stars, and spoken over with charms that belonged to temples long since fallen silent. A famous and beautiful copy made in the early 6th century for a Roman noblewoman, the one we now call the Vienna Dioscorides, shows the plants painted with great care, and among its pages sits a figure of discovery herself, handing the mandrake root up to the author, a whole vision of nature and knowledge that owed nothing to the church at all. The men who later copied such books in their monasteries were, in a quiet way, keeping a pagan world alive on their own shelves, and some of them knew it and were uneasy. Nothing shows this old strangeness more plainly than the mandrake, the root that Dioscorides himself had described, sober and exact, as a true medicine, boiled down in wine. He wrote, "It could be given to a patient before the knife or the cautery, to dull the pain and bring on a heavy sleep." And in this he was entirely right, for the plant holds within it a real and dangerous power to numb and to send a person under. But the mandrake had gathered to itself, long before Dioscorides and long after him, a thick growth of legend that no plain description could strip away. Its forked root, which can look unsettlingly like a small human body, was said to grow beneath the gallows, to shriek when it was drawn from the earth, and to kill the one who heard the cry, so that the careful gatherer was told to loosen the soil, tie the root to a dog, and let the poor animal pull it free from a safe distance. Here in a single plant was the whole difficulty in miniature, a sound and useful medicine wound about with a rite and a terror that the church could only look upon askance, and yet could not quite bring itself to cast away. Alongside Dioscorides there came down a second great authority, the physician Galen, who wrote in the 2nd century, and whose long shadow fell across every sick bed in Europe for well over 1,000 years. It was Galen, building on older Greek thought, who taught that the body was governed by 4 humours, the blood and the phlegm and the 2 biles, and that health was their balance and sickness their disorder. Every plant, in this scheme, was hot or cold, moist or dry, in this degree or that, and a remedy worked by nudging the humours back toward their proper measure. This was not, in itself, a pagan doctrine so much as an older science, but it too came robed in the authority of the ancient world, and to question Galen came in time to feel almost as bold as to question Scripture. The medieval healer thus inherited not only a shelf of plants, but a whole frame of mind through which to see them, and both had been handed down from before the faith that now kept them. Beside these stood the vast, tumbling work of Pliny the Elder, a Roman of enormous curiosity who set out, in the same 1st century, to write down more or less everything. His natural history ran to 37 books, and great stretches of it concerned plants and their uses. Gathered from every author, he could lay his hands on and poured out with very little sorting of the sound from the fanciful. Pliny died, it was said, going too near the burning mountain of Vesuvius, drawn by the same restless wish to see for himself that fills his pages. His book carried, alongside real and useful remedies, a great cargo of charms and marvels, of herbs plucked with the left hand and roots that must be dug by moonlight, and the medieval reader took it all down together, unable, often, to tell which parts were medicine and which were something older and stranger. There was a third book, humbler and more practical than either of these, that reached the early monasteries and settled in more deeply than almost any other. It went under the name of Apuleius, though the true author is unknown, and so we call him now the false Apuleius, or pseudo-Apuleius. His herbarium was a short, working catalogue of plants, each with its picture and its list of cures, and because it was small and useful, it was copied again and again through the darkest and quietest centuries, when the great libraries of the ancient world had already fallen into ruin. It is a plain little book, and that plainness was its salvation, for grand books are burned and looted, while humble ones are simply used until they fall apart and are copied out afresh. But even this modest herbal carried the old world inside it. Tucked among its sensible directions were instructions of another kind, telling the gatherer to approach a certain plant in a certain way, to draw a circle about it with an iron tool, to speak to it, to take it under the right sign of the sky, remnants of a way of gathering that saw the plant as a living power to be asked, rather than a mere ingredient to be picked. The little herb Betony, so trusted that one old line claimed a man should plant it in his churchyard and wear it against fear in the dark, came with just such directions, half medicine and half rite. A reader in a Christian cloister, copying these lines faithfully, because that was what a copyist did, found himself setting down words that his own faith looked upon with a narrowed eye, and the small tension in that act, repeated in scriptorium after scriptorium, is really the beginning of our whole story tonight. It is worth remembering how narrowly even these books survived at all. When the western half of the Roman world came apart, its cities shrank, its schools closed, and its libraries, which had never held more than a few precious copies of any work, began to rot and scatter and burn. A great many books of the ancient world simply ceased to exist in those centuries, not through any single act of destruction, but through neglect, through damp and mice, and the slow forgetting of the tongue they were written in. That Dioscorides and Pliny, and the little herbarium came through it all was very largely because a scattering of monasteries, almost by accident, became the only quiet harbours left where a book might be copied before the last copy failed. The remedy books were nearly lost once already, then long before anyone thought to forbid them, and their first rescuers were the same men who would later look on their pagan contents with such unease. For this was the quiet difficulty at the root of everything that followed. The knowledge could not simply be thrown away. Too much of it worked, or seemed to work, and a monastery that tended the sick could not do without the poppy for pain, or the willow for fever, or the 100 small remedies that eased a long night. But neither could the knowledge be swallowed whole, for it came wrapped in a whole vanished religion, in gods and charms and rites that the church could not bless. And so, rather than destroy the inheritance, the medieval world set about the long, patient work of remaking it, of keeping the plant and quietly changing the words that came with it. And it is to that gentle labor that we turn now. Let us turn now to the renaming of the herbs and to the saints who came, one by one, to stand where the old gods had stood. The simplest way to keep a useful plant while parting from its pagan past was also the quietest. You did not have to burn the herb, or forbid it, or argue with the farm wife who had always trusted it. You had only to change its name and let the new name carry a new meaning, until, over the slow turning of generations, the old association faded like a scent, and the plant belonged, in everyone's mind, to the new world rather than the old. And so across medieval Europe, the herbs were gently baptized. Plants that had once belonged to a god or a season, or a rite found themselves given, instead, to a saint, and the change went so smoothly, and took so long, that hardly anyone thought of it as a change at all. It felt less like a conquest than like a slow settling, the way snow settles over a familiar field, and leaves every shape still visible beneath it, softened and made new. Consider the plant we still call St. John's wort, that small, bright, yellow-flowered herb of the summer banks and hedgerows. Long before any saint was attached to it, it belonged to the height of the year, to the midsummer sun at its strongest, and it was gathered at the solstice, when the light stood longest in the sky, hung in windows and over doors against the dark of the year to come. When the church set the feast of St. John the Baptist at that same turning point of midsummer, the herb passed quietly into his keeping, and the old solstice gathering became a gathering on St. John's Eve. The flowers now offered in his name. The plant did not change. The day did not change. Only the words changed and the meaning behind them, and country people went on hanging the same gold flowers in the same windows, as they always had, sure now that it was a holy thing they did. The same gentle grafting happened again and again. A whole family of plants was given to the Virgin, so that a garden came in time to be full of Our Lady's flowers, her mantle and her bedstraw, her smock and her gold, the last of these the bright marigold, whose very name remembers her. The milk thistle, marked with pale veins across its dark leaves, was said in the old story to have been streaked by a drop of the Virgin's milk as she nursed her child beneath it, and so it too became Our Lady's thistle. Its use for the liver and the nursing mother carried along quietly beneath the tender legend. There was Herb Bennet, whose name is worn down from the Latin for the blessed herb, Avens, its threefold leaf and fivefold flower read, as a small sermon on the Trinity and the wounds, and its clove-scented root hung over doors to turn aside evil. There was Herb Robert and Herb Christopher, and the herb of Saint Benedict and Angelica, the tall sweet root that the old books claim was shown to a monk in a dream by an angel as a guard against the plague, and named ever after for that heavenly messenger. Perhaps the clearest example of all is the herb the Romans had called the holy plant vervain, sacred to their altars, and it was said, to the priests of the older peoples before them, gathered with great ceremony, and used to sweep the temple floors. Such a plant could hardly be left in pagan hands, and so a new story was quietly told of it, that it had grown at the foot of the cross and had been used to staunch the wounds of Christ, and from that day it was the holy herb of a new faith entirely, gathered still with a few murmured words, but words now addressed to a different heaven. The gatherer might not have known she had inherited a Roman rite. She knew only that this was a blessed plant, and that you spoke over it as you cut it, and that was enough. Some of these new stories were so tender that it is easy to see why they took hold and would not let go. The soft, sweet scented plant we call Our Lady's bedstraw was said to have been among the humble herbs strewn in the manger at Bethlehem, laid down as bedding for the newborn child. And country belief held that its flowers, once a plain white, had turned to shining gold in that holy hour, and had kept the color ever after. The plant had a plain enough use about the ordinary house, dried to sweeten a mattress or set to help curdle milk into cheese. But wrapped in that gentle legend, it became something a mother might handle with a little reverence, and teach her daughter to handle so as well. Whatever older meaning the herb had once carried was simply gone, painted over by a story no one wished to argue with, and the remedy traveled on inside the legend as safely as a seed inside its fruit. Underneath all this renaming there lay a quiet piece of reasoning that let the whole thing rest easy on a Christian conscience. If a plant healed, the thinking went, then its power to heal had been placed in it by the God who made it, set there in the green leaf and the bitter root for the good of the sick, waiting only to be found and used with thanks. The virtue was a gift, not a magic, and to gather the herb and speak a blessing over it was not to work a spell, but to receive a mercy. This gentle idea, that the healing green of the world was itself a kind of grace, ran through the writings of thoughtful churchmen and pious healers alike, and it did more than any decree could have done to make the inherited plant lore welcome. The herb was innocent, the power was God's. Only the old words needed changing, and those, one by one, were quietly changed. The Church did not only permit this quiet baptizing of the herbs. In places it took the whole business gently into its own hands. On the feast of the Assumption in high summer, in many parts of the German and Alpine lands, the faithful carried great bundles of gathered herbs into the church to be blessed at the altar. The mugwort and the yarrow, the mullein and the wormwood, tied up with corn and a stem or two of flour, and these blessed bundles were then hung in the house through the year and burned, a pinch at a time, against storms and sickness. Here was the old midsummer gathering of the strongest herbs, once so entangled with rites the church could not own, now brought inside the church door and stained with holy water and a Latin prayer. The plant had come home, as it were, to a new house, and no one now thought to ask whose house it had lived in before. There is something worth pausing on in all of this before we move on. This renaming was not, for the most part, a thing done by decree from above, by bishops issuing lists of permitted names. It rose up instead from below, from the slow habit of ordinary people who wished to keep their remedies and keep their faith at the same time, and found, without ever quite planning it, that the two could be reconciled by a saint's name and a Christian word spoken where a pagan one had been. A monk copying a herbal, a mother teaching a daughter, a priest blessing the fields at Rogatiantide, each added a small stitch to the same quiet mending, until the seam between the old world and the new could scarcely be found at all. The habit ran so deep that it reached even into the shops of the learned apothecaries. There was one bitter thistle, praised across the 16th century as a cure for very nearly everything, for fevers and plague and the failing memory. that went by the plain and telling name of the blessed thistle, the holy thistle, its very title a small blessing worn, like a badge. Gentle women distilled its leaves into a bracing water, physicians prescribed it, and it turns up by that pious name in the plays and household books of the age as the most ordinary thing in the world. No one who reached for the blessed thistle stopped to wonder why a plant should be called holy. The saint's shadow and the blessing had sunk so far into the very names of the herbs that they had become simply what the plants were called, their old baptism long forgotten, and wholly complete. And yet not every old word could be so gently replaced. Some of the sayings that travelled with the herbs were older and stranger than a mere name, whole charms and rhymes and spoken workings that did not sit easily beside a saint's blessing. And it was over these, and over the narrow, shifting line between a prayer and a charm, that the real unease of the church would gather. It is to that line, faint and much argued over, that we turn now. A herb could be given a saint's name easily enough, and a rite of gathering could be softened into a blessing. But there was one part of the old plant medicine that would not yield so quietly, and that was the spoken word itself. Not the name of the plant, but the words said over it and over the sick body, the charm, the rhyme, the string of half-understood syllables that a healer murmured while she bound a wound or stirred a draught. These were harder to change because they were not merely labels but workings, believed to carry a power of their own. And it was here, along the faint and shifting border between a prayer and a charm, that the church watched most closely and grew most uneasy. The difficulty was that the church had never wished to forbid all words spoken over the sick. Quite the opposite. It offered a great treasury of its own, the psalms and the paternoster, the blessing of the priest, the sign of the cross made over a fevered child, the holy water sprinkled in a sick room, the oil laid on the dying. Words, in the church's own hands, were among its most powerful medicines, and no one thought a prayer said over a poultice to be anything but good. The trouble came, not from the speaking of words as such, but from which words were spoken, and from what was thought to give them their force. For there was a kind of word the church could not bless, and it knew the kind when it heard it. A charm that worked, so it was believed, by its own hidden power, by the sound of the syllables or the shape of the letters rather than by any appeal to God. A string of names that no Christian could name. A knot tied with a rhyme, a written character sewn into a pouch, an amulet hung about the neck that healed by virtue of itself. These the old writers called ligatures and characters, bindings and signs, and in them the church smelled the smoke of the old religion. The notion that a person might command health by a secret working rather than beg it as a mercy. It was not the herb that troubled them. It was the whisper that went with it. Some of these workings were not whispered at all but written, and these troubled the learned most of all. There was an old charm against fever, older than the church itself, in which a single long word was written out on a scrap of parchment, and then copied again beneath itself line by line, each time with one letter taken away, until the word dwindled to a single letter, and the whole made a shrinking triangle of script, worn about the neck, so that the fever might dwindle with it. There was a square of 5 words that could be read the same forward, backward, up and down, a small marvel of letters that country people scratched on walls and bowls and carried folded against sickness, though few who carried it could have told you what the words meant. These were the characters the churchmen spoke of, marks that seemed to heal by their own arrangement, by number and shape rather than by any prayer. And it is a curious thing that they survive so plentifully precisely in the medical books, copied by the same hands that elsewhere warned against them. Much of what we know about this quiet unease comes from a curious kind of book that the Church produced in great numbers, the Penitential, a handbook made to guide a priest as he heard confession. These were not grand works of theology. They were practical lists, setting out the sins a person might commit and the penance each one carried, and because they tried to be complete, they preserve for us, quite by accident, a detailed picture of exactly what ordinary people were doing with their herbs and their charms, written down by the very men who wished to correct it. The most famous of them was gathered in the early 11th century by Burchard, the Bishop of Worms, in a long work whose 19th book came to be known on its own as the Corrector. In it, Burchard set down the questions a confessor might ask, and among them are questions that open a small window straight into the herb garden of the age. Have you gathered herbs? The penitent was to be asked, with evil incantations, and not with the creed and the Lord's Prayer. Have you tied charms upon yourself or your children, or made knots, or believed the women who claim they can turn aside a storm or heal by spoken spells? The penance for these things was real, but rarely harsh, a matter of fasting and prayer. For the Church understood that it was dealing less with wickedness than with an old habit that would not die. And here we come to the gentlest and most telling thing of all. Burchard's cure for the forbidden charm was not to forbid the words entirely, but to change them. Gather your herb, he in effect allowed, but say over it the creed and the paternoster, not the old rhyme. Let the words that go with the plant be God's words. In that small permission lies the reason so many old charms survive to us, not in their pagan shape at all, but christened, baptized like the plants themselves. The heathen invocation quietly swapped for a holy one, while the rest of the working carried on much as before. You can see the same gentle exchange in the very act of gathering, where an older healer might have taken her herb with a rhyme addressed to who knows what. The christened gatherer was taught to kneel, to say the Lord's Prayer over the plant, to pick it with the right hand while the words were spoken, and to give thanks as she cut. Even the counting was baptized. The old workings had loved their numbers, the 3s and the 7s and the 9s, and rather than forbid the counting, the Church simply filled it with holy things, 3 paternosters here, 9 repetitions of a psalm there, so that a healer measuring out her charm by the old sacred numbers was now measuring it in prayers. To an onlooker little seemed to have changed. The same woman knelt by the same plant and counted under her breath as she always had. Only the words she counted were different, and that difference was enough to let the whole quiet practice go on with the Church's blessing rather than against it. Not every churchman was so mild. Centuries earlier, Caesarius, the Bishop of Arles in southern Gaul, had preached against amulets and bindings with real heat, warning his flock that to hang a written charm about a sick child's neck was to trade the medicine of Christ for the medicine of the devil, and reminding them sharply that this was true even when the charm had been written out by a member of the clergy, as it sometimes was. "Come to the church for your healing," he told them. "Take the blessed oil, receive the sacrament, and leave the ligatures and the herb spells to those who do not know better." His sermons were copied and read aloud for centuries after his death, which tells us both how seriously the Church took the matter and how stubbornly the old habits held on, for a warning does not need repeating unless the thing it warns against keeps returning. What came of all this watching and correcting was not the death of the charm, but its slow conversion, and the Christianized charms that resulted are among the most touching things in the whole record. To stop a wound bleeding, a healer might no longer call on some forgotten power, but instead recite the tale of the river Jordan, bidding the blood to stand still in the body, as the water of Jordan had stood still when Christ was baptized in it. To draw a thorn or heal a wound, she might tell the story of the three good brothers walking to the Mount of Olives to gather herbs, meeting Christ upon the road, and being taught by him the words of healing. These little narrative charms, half prayer and half spell, sit in manuscript after manuscript, and in them you can watch the old working and the new faith reach a quiet, lasting truce, neither one quite winning, both agreeing to share the same breath. It must be said that the line the Church tried to draw was never a clear one, even to the churchmen themselves. The Church had its own long tradition of blessing things, of speaking words over salt and water to make them holy, of laying prayers upon oil and bread, and the herbs carried in at harvest, and to a villager standing in the porch. It was not always easy to see how the priest's blessing of a bundle of herbs differed from the healer's charm over the same bundle. Both were words spoken to make a thing well. Both leaned on holy names and sacred numbers. The learned could explain the difference in careful terms, that the one begged a mercy of God, while the other presumed to command a power directly. But out in the parish, the two ran together like rainwater, and many a good Christian saw no reason to choose between the blessing at the altar and the charm at the bedside, taking comfort freely from both. The border, in truth, was less a wall than a mist, and people passed back and forth across it all their lives, without ever quite noticing they had. So the Church, in the end, did not so much erase the charm as put a cross upon it. The word that healed went on being spoken over the sick for 1,000 years and more. But it learned to speak in a Christian voice, to name Christ and the Jordan and the good brothers where it had once named who knows what. The herb and its whispered word travelled on together, only a little changed, and if you wish to see them travelling side by side, plant remedy and holy charm sharing a single page, you need only open one of the old remedy books of the cold north, where the whole of this quiet bargain was written down in the people's own tongue. It is to those northern books that we turn now. Far from Rome, in the damp green kingdoms of the north, something happened that was rare in the whole of medieval Europe. The old plant medicine was written down, not in the Latin of the church and the schools, but in the ordinary spoken tongue of the people themselves, in Old English, the language of the farm and the hearth. Most medicine of the age hid behind Latin, readable only by the learned few. In England, for a little while, the remedies were set down in words a leech, as the healer was then called, could read aloud and understand, and because of this we can hear, more clearly than almost anywhere else, exactly what the northern healer knew and did and said. The greatest of these books has come down to us under a borrowed name. At the end of it, an old line records that a man called Bald owned the book and had ordered another, named Seiled, to write it out for him, and so we call it, to this day, Bald's Leechbook. It was copied in the 10th century, most likely at Winchester, in the years when the house of King Alfred was gathering learning back into England after long seasons of war, and it is a careful, orderly thing. Its remedies set out from the head downward to the feet, as though a physician were examining a patient from crown to sole. Whoever Bald was, he wanted a proper book of physic, arranged and reliable, and Seiled gave him one. What fills its pages is a quiet marvel of gathering from every corner of the known world. Alongside native English cures made of the herbs of the hedgerow and the field, there are remedies drawn from the classical past, from Greek and Latin sources, carried north across the whole of Christendom, folded in among the local salves, as though there were no distance between them at all. In one remarkable passage the book records cures said to have been sent all the way from the Patriarch of Jerusalem in the far eastern Mediterranean as a gift to King Alfred himself. A remedy might begin its life on a sunlit hillside in the Holy Land and end it, centuries and thousands of miles later, written out in a monastery in rainy Wessex, and no one setting it down thought this in the least remarkable. Bound in with Bald's 2 orderly books, there comes a third, older in feeling and more deeply English, that scholars now simply call the third Leechbook. Here the classical learning thins away, and something closer to the native root of the matter shows through. Remedies against troubles that the old healers laid at the door of unseen beings. The elves and the night walkers and the flying things that were thought to shoot sickness into a body from a distance. There are salves here against what the book calls elf disease and the water elf sickness, made of many gathered herbs and blessed with sung prayers and directions for a holy salve to be brewed against the temptations of the night. To a modern ear the ailments sound like fever and swelling and troubled sleep, named in the language of an older understanding, and the cures for them are the same patient mixtures of herb and word we have met throughout, the green medicine of the field wedded to the spoken blessing, written down plainly by a hand that believed in both. Beside Bald's orderly book, there survives another, stranger and more tangled collection, gathered under the name the Lacnunga, which means simply the remedies. Where Bald's book is a physician's ordered manual, the Lacnunga is a healer's untidy commonplace, a heap of cures and charms and prayers, jumbled together as they were collected, and precisely because it was never tidied, it kept things that a more careful book might have quietly dropped. It is in the Lacnunga that some of the oldest and most openly heathen material in all of English survives, written down by a Christian hand that seems to have valued the old words too much to let them go. Chief among these is the working we now call the 9 Herbs charm, a long, rolling verse that names 9 healing plants, the mugwort and the plantain, the watercress and the nettle, the chamomile and the crabapple, the thyme and the fennel, and one whose very name is now uncertain, and sets them against poison and infection and the flying venom of the air. And in the middle of this catalogue of good English herbs, without apology or explanation, the charm turns and names Wadden, the old god, telling how he took 9 glory twigs and struck the serpent until it flew apart into 9 pieces. Here, in a manuscript otherwise full of Christ and the saints, a heathen god is called upon by name to make the plant medicine work, and the scribe wrote it down all the same, unwilling, it seems, to lose a word of a charm that healers had trusted for longer than anyone could remember. The same book holds a working against what it calls a sudden stitch, a stabbing pain in the side of the kind we might now think a cramp, which it blames on the shot of unseen powers, the arrows of elves and of mighty women who ride across the land, and answers with a red-hot smith hammering out a little knife of iron. It is a strange and beautiful thing to read, this poem of invisible archers and a healer answering their darts, and it too was kept and copied by Christian hands, folded in among the paternosters and the psalms, the old fear and the new faith lying down together on the same page, as though they had never quarrelled at all. The mingling ran right down into the smallest directions for making a cure. Again and again these books tell the healer not only which herbs to gather and how to pound and steep them, but which holy words to sing over the pot while the work is done. Sing this psalm over the herbs before you gather them, one receipt will say, and sing the Lord's Prayer over the salve so many times as it stands, and let a priest sing a mass over the ingredients before they are used. The prayer was not an afterthought laid on top of the medicine. It was written into the receipt as surely as the wine or the honey, one more ingredient without which the cure was thought incomplete. A modern reader, tidy-minded, might wish to separate the herb from the hymn, and keep only the part that a chemist could measure. But the healer who wrote these lines would not have understood the wish. To her the singing and the steeping were one work, and to leave out the words would have been as strange as leaving out the herb, for that is the quiet lesson of the northern books. On one leaf a salve is to be blessed with the Lord's Prayer sung over it a fixed number of times while it brews, and on the next a charm calls upon the old god or the elf smith, and the same careful hand wrote both, and saw, it seems, no war between them that could not be borne. The healer of the cold north kept everything, the Christian and the heathen, the herb and the whispered word, because all of it, in her experience, sometimes worked, and she was too practical and too poor to throw away anything that might ease a neighbor's pain on a long dark night. And now and then, across the great gulf of years, one of these old receipts turns out to have kept a secret even its makers did not fully know. In Bald's Leechbook there stands a remedy for an infection of the eye, a salve made of garlic and another plant of the onion kind, pounded together with wine and with the bile of an ox, left to stand in a vessel of brass for 9 nights, and then strained through a cloth before use. For 1,000 years it lay there, one small receipt among hundreds, until in fairly recent times a group of scholars at the University of Nottingham, working with a microbiologist, decided to make it up again exactly as the old book directs, and to see what it would do. What it did, in their laboratory, was kill one of the most stubborn and dangerous bacteria known to modern medicine, the one that resists so many of our own drugs. Told plainly, without any fuss, the old salve of garlic and wine and ox gall, brewed for 9 nights in brass, did something real. It is sobering to think how nearly we came to never being able to test it at all. These great books of English physics survive, each of them, in only a single copy, one worn manuscript apiece, carried down through 1,000 years of fire and damp and neglect and simple bad luck. Had the one book of bold burned in any of the many fires that took so many of its fellows, the eyesalve and its slow brass brewing would have vanished with it, and no laboratory could ever have recovered what no page recorded. The old word for such a remedy was a leechdom, a healing thing, and the whole body of this knowledge came within a hair of being lost as utterly as the countless leechdoms that were written into books now ash. That we can still read these cures and even make them up again, we owe entirely to a handful of surviving volumes and the quiet good fortune that kept them whole. There is no need to make a marvel of it. The old healer did not know what a bacterium was and would not have thanked you for the word. She knew only that this salve, made just so and no other way, tended to answer for a sore eye, and she wrote it down carefully so that it might answer again. What the modern laboratory added was not the working, but only a name for why it worked, and a quiet confirmation that the patient watching of many generations had, in this case, found its way to something true. It is a fitting thought to carry with us as we leave the northern books, that the men who so distrusted the old plant lore were also, at that very moment, the men copying it faithfully enough that we could one day test it and find it sound. To those copyists, the monks bent over their desks in the long silence of the scriptorium, saving what they doubted. We turn now. There is a gentle irony at the heart of our whole story, and we come to it now. The very men who looked most narrowly upon the old plant lore, who worried over its pagan roots and its heathen charms, were also the men who saved it. Not despite their doubts, but right alongside them, bent over their desks in the long silence of the copying room, they preserved the ancient books of medicine more faithfully than any other people in Europe, and without their patient, doubting labor we would have almost nothing left to speak of at all. The reason lay woven into the very rule by which the monks lived. When Benedict set down his guide for the monastic life, he placed the care of the sick above almost every other duty, telling his monks that the sick were to be served before and above all else, as though Christ himself lay in the infirmary bed. A house that took this seriously could not do without medicine. It needed a room for the ill, a brother who knew the herbs, a garden to grow them in, and above all, books, the written knowledge of how to tell one plant from another and what each was good for. And so the monastery, that most Christian of places, found itself obliged to keep and study the medical learning of the pagan past, because charity toward the sick demanded it. One of the earliest to see this clearly was a Roman statesman turned monk named Cassiodorus, who in the 6th century founded a monastery at his old family estate in the south of Italy and set down instructions for the brothers there. Among them he urged, in plain and touching words, that those who cared for the sick should learn the properties of herbs and the mixing of remedies, and should study the old physicians, Dioscorides above all, even if they had no Greek and must lean on Latin. Learn the healing art, he told them in effect, and if you cannot read the great authors, at least learn the plants of the field, and place all your hope in the Lord, who gives medicine its power. Here, at the very dawn of the monastic centuries, a Christian voice was telling monks to preserve and study the pagan books of physic as an act of faith. we should pause a moment on what the saving of a book actually meant in those days, for it was not the passive thing we might imagine. A book did not survive simply by being left alone. Left alone, it rotted, or was gnawed, or crumbled, or faded past reading, and every copy in the world might be lost within a few generations if no one renewed it. A book survived only by being copied out again by hand, letter by letter, page by page, before the last old copy failed, and then copied again from that copy in its turn, an endless relay running down the centuries, in which every runner was a scribe bent over a desk in the cold. To save Dioscorides was to copy him, and to copy him was months of labor, and the monks did it, over and over for 1,000 years. They built their gardens to match their books. We possess a remarkable drawing from the early 9th century, a plan for an ideal monastery, drawn up and sent to the abbot of St. Gall, in what is now Switzerland, showing everything such a house should contain, and there, neatly marked near the infirmary and the physician's quarters, is a physic garden, its beds ruled off one from another, and each one labelled with the herb it should hold. Sage and rue, mint and rosemary, iris and cumin, and the rest, laid out in tidy rows, so that the brother, tending the sick, had only to step from the sick room into the garden to gather what he needed. The plan was never built exactly as drawn, but it tells us what the age thought a proper monastery ought to be, and a garden of healing herbs was as much a part of that vision as the church and the cloister themselves. We even have a poem from one such garden. A monk of the island monastery of Reichenau, named Wallafrid, wrote in the 9th century a gentle set of verses about his own small plot, describing how he cleared the winter ground and coaxed the herbs to life, and speaking of each plant in turn, the sage and the rue, the sharp southernwood and the healing horehound, with the particular fondness of a man who has knelt in the dirt beside them. It is one of the loveliest things to survive from the whole period, this little poem of a monk and his herb bed, and it shows us the plant medicine of the age, not as forbidden knowledge at all, but as a quiet daily pleasure, tended by a devout man for the good of his brothers and the love of the growing green. Within the walls, one brother in particular carried this work as his charge. The infirmera, the monk set over the sick, kept the keys to the herb store and the still, tended the drying of the summer's gathering, and mixed the salves and the drinks by which his brothers were nursed through their fevers and their old age. He was a physician of a modest, practical kind, learned less from grand argument than from the same book of long experience the village healer read, and the monastery gave him what the village woman lacked: a warm, dry room, a shelf of written remedies, and the leisure to copy and study them. In him the two great streams of the age's healing met and mingled, the bookish learning of the classical past and the hand-won knowledge of the sick-bed, and out of that meeting came much of what the later medicine of Europe would build upon. There was in time a second great inpouring of the old knowledge, and it too came to rest in these monastic houses. Much of the learning of Greece, lost to the Latin West in the long dark centuries, had been carried east and kept alive by the scholars of the Arabic-speaking world, who translated Dioscorides and Galen into their own tongue, studied them, and added to them the fruits of their own great physicians. In the 11th century this treasure began to flow back, above all through a traveller who settled at the mother house on its Italian hill and gave the rest of his life to turning the Arabic medical books into Latin so that the West might read again in fuller form the very authors its own monasteries had half preserved. The old plant knowledge thus came home by two long roads at once, one running unbroken down the copying rooms of the north, the other looping out through the libraries of a wholly different faith and back again, and both roads ended at the same monastic door. From the great mother house of the order, the monastery that Benedict himself had founded on its high Italian hill, this tradition of healing and of copying spread outward across Europe, and in time it reached down to the coastal town nearby where, some centuries later, the first true medical school of the medieval West would gather. The thread runs unbroken from the monk copying Dioscorides in his cell to the physicians who would one day teach medicine as a proper study, and it is a thread spun at every turn by hands that also turned the pages of a prayer book. The healing of the body and the saving of the soul, so often set against each other, ran here side by side down the same quiet corridors. Not everyone was easy about it, and one book above all shows us the argument being had. From the Abbey of Lorsch in the German lands, there survives a collection of remedies made near the end of the 8th century, and at its head stands something rare and moving, a written defense of the very idea of medicine. Some devout people, its preface admits, hold that to seek a cure for the body is to show a want of faith, that a Christian should bear sickness as the will of God and look only to prayer. Not so, the writer answers, gently but firmly. God made the herbs and gave them their virtues for our healing. Christ himself went about healing the sick and bade his followers do the same. To tend the body is a work of mercy, pleasing to heaven, no rival to faith, but a companion of it. Here is a book that had to argue, at its very opening, for its own right to exist, and the argument it makes is the argument that let all the other books survive. That quiet tension never entirely went away. There were always some, in every century, who felt that the healer's art strayed too near a distrust of providence, that a truly faithful soul should reach for the psalter before the salve. The answer the Church settled on in the end was the one the Abbey of Lorsch had given, that healing was itself a gift of God and a duty of love, and it was this settlement, more than any decree, that kept the medical books on the shelves and the physic gardens in the ground. The doubt was real, but the doubt lost, and it lost so thoroughly that the monasteries became, for many centuries, the surest refuge that the old plant knowledge had anywhere in the world. The copying was never perfect, and that too is part of the story. A scribe working from a worn old book, in a script he found strange, describing plants he had never seen growing in his northern soil, made mistakes. A name was garbled, a picture of a herb was copied from a copy of a copy, until it resembled no plant on earth. A remedy meant for one complaint drifted, through a slip of the pen, to another. The knowledge came down to us a little blurred by all this handling, like a coin worn smooth by passing through too many pockets. And yet the wonder is not that errors crept in, but that so much came through sound, that a remedy set down by a Greek army doctor in the 1st century could still be read, and understood, and even made up again, 100 generations later, thanks to an unbroken chain of tired, careful, faithful hands. So we owe the survival of the old plant medicine, in large part, to its doubters. the uneasy monk who copied the pagan herbal because charity demanded it, the abbot who defended medicine against the pious who despised it, the brother who knelt in his physic garden between the hours of prayer. These were the keepers of the very knowledge their faith looked upon with such suspicion. There is no contradiction in it, really, only the ordinary human truth that we often preserve most carefully, the things we are not quite sure we should keep. The books were saved by the same world that fretted over them, and that is perhaps the deepest reason they were never truly erased. But there was one great library that even the faithful monks could not save, for the simple reason that it had never been written down at all. It lived not on any shelf, but in the memory of the women who held it, passed from mouth to hand, and never once set in ink. And when its keepers died, unless a daughter had learned it whole, it died with them, leaving no page for any scribe to copy, and no volume for any censor to burn. It is to that vast, vanished, unwritten library that we turn now. We have spoken all this while of books, of manuscripts copied and hidden and saved, but the greatest loss of plant knowledge in the whole history of medicine was not the loss of any book. It was the loss of the knowledge that was never a book to begin with. For the larger part of all the healing wisdom of the ordinary world was held not by the literate monk or the university physician, but by the village healer, the good wife, the midwife, the wise woman at the parish edge, and almost none of them could write, and so almost none of what they knew was ever set down at all. Their knowledge lived by a different and older means. It passed from an old woman's hands into a young woman's memory, by watching and doing and repeating, by rhyme and by long apprenticeship at a mother's or an aunt's side. And it was carried not in a volume on a shelf, but in the living head of its keeper. This made it, in one way, wonderfully durable, for a memory cannot be burned and a rhyme cannot be seized in a raid. But it made it in another way terribly fragile, for it hung entirely on the unbroken passing of the knowledge from one generation to the next. And if that chain broke even once, if a woman died before she had taught what she knew, then a whole small library of remedies simply went out of the world in an afternoon, silently, leaving no trace that it had ever been. What we know of this vast oral learning, we know mostly at second hand, and poorly. It reaches us only through the writings of people who were not its keepers, the monk copying a remedy he had heard of, the town physician grudgingly noting a cure he had seen a village woman work, the court clerk taking down testimony against a healer at a trial. The wise woman's own voice comes to us always filtered through others who did not always understand what they were recording, or who valued it little, and so we hear her as one hears a song through a thick wall, the tune faintly there, most of the words lost. Whole lifetimes of careful observation have come down to us as a line or two in someone else's book. It is worth trying to picture what that unwritten library actually held, for it was no small thing. It held the knowing of 100 plants by leaf and scent and season, and of which bank each grew upon, and at what hour each was best taken. It held the making of the salves and the syrups, the right heat and the right measure. Learn not from any written weight, but from the feel of a paste between the fingers and the color of a drink against the light. It held the reading of a sick body, the signs that told a fever from a chill and a passing trouble from a grave one. It held the birthing law, the turning of a child, and the easing of a hard labor. Knowledge on which whole villages depended, and which no book of the age set down half so fully. All of this a wise woman carried in her head as lightly as she carried her basket, and all of it, unless she taught it whole, went with her into the ground. And now and then the surviving scraps let us guess at how much has been lost. Folklorists of much later centuries, going about the countryside to gather the last living memories of the old healers before they faded for good, found the same rhymes and the same small customs cropping up in villages that lay 100 miles apart, and had never, so far as anyone knew, been in any contact at all. The same blessing spoken over a burn, the same rule for gathering a certain root, the same turn of phrase in a charm, recurring across whole countries and whole centuries. Such wide agreement does not arise by chance. It points back to some common source, some shared body of teaching passed hand to hand across the generations, a great oral book that everyone once knew and no one ever wrote, of which only these last torn pages remained by the time anyone thought to save them. There are a precious few exceptions, women who by some rare turn of fortune did right, and who therefore let us hear, just for a moment, a keeper of this knowledge speaking in her own person. The greatest of them was Hildegard, the abbess of a Rhineland convent in the 12th century, a woman of formidable learning and force of will who set down, among much else, 2 books of natural medicine. In one she went through the created world, plant by plant and stone by stone and creature by creature, describing the healing virtue of each. And in the other she wrote of the causes of sickness and their cures, weaving together the old humoral learning and her own long observation of the sick who came to her infirmary door. Running through all her writing on healing was a word she made peculiarly her own, a word for the fresh green life force that she saw flowing through every living plant, the greening power by which the dry seed swelled and the bare branch leafed, and the whole world renewed itself each spring. To Hildegard, this greenness was a kind of divine vitality, the visible sign of God's life at work in creation, and a sick body was, in her seeing, a body whose greenness had faded and needed to be restored. It is a lovely idea and a rare gift to have it in the very words of a medieval woman who tended the sick with her own hands, when so many thousands of her sisters in the work left us nothing at all. We should be clear about why she, of all women, could write when almost none of the rest could. Hildegard was an abbess, the head of a religious house, protected, educated, and given a voice by her position and by the visions that the Church came to accept as holy. She had letters and leisure and an authority that a laywoman healer could never have claimed. The ordinary wise woman had none of these things. She had no schooling, no protected station, no visions the Church would honor, only her hands and her memory and her long day's work. And so her equal knowledge, held perhaps as fully as Hildegard held hers, simply never found its way onto a page. What survives is not the best knowledge, but the best placed. Something similar hangs about the other great name in this tale, a woman remembered as Trotula, associated with the medical school of the southern Italian town of Salerno in the same rough age. Under her name there travelled a body of writing on the health of women, on childbirth and its troubles and the care of mothers, that was copied all across Europe and trusted for centuries. And yet, as the centuries wore on, her very existence came to be doubted. Some scribes took her name for the title of the book, rather than the name of its author. Some later hands quietly changed her into a man, unwilling to believe a woman could have written so learnedly. That a real woman's name could be so worn away, argued out of existence, turned into a mere title or reassigned to some imagined male author, is itself a kind of erasure, quieter than any burning but every bit as effective. For even the written knowledge of women was handled roughly by the passing years. Hildegard's books of medicine were copied far less often than her visions and her music, as though the age found her healing lore the least interesting of her gifts. The writings that went under Trotula's name were reshaped and reassigned, and behind these two survivors stood the countless others who never wrote a word, whose entire learning was a spoken thing that lived and died within a single skull. This was forbidding of a subtler kind than any censor practiced. No one banned these books. They were simply never allowed to become books at all, kept from the page by a world that would not teach their keepers to write. And yet, in its own quiet way, even this most vulnerable knowledge refused to vanish entirely. It went on living where it had always lived, in the memory of daughters, in the names country people still gave their plants, in the rhymes and the small customs that outlasted every woman who ever spoke them. We will come, at the very end of our evening, to that stubborn survival in the common memory. But first let us return to the world of the written book, and to a clever and humble way in which the unlettered and the watched over managed, after all, to smuggle their remedies onto the page. They wrote them in the margins. It is to the margins that we turn now. If you could not own a whole book of medicine, and most people never could, you could still write down a remedy you did not wish to lose. You simply wrote it in the book you already had. In the blank leaf at the front or the back, in the wide margins beside the printed or written text, in any small clear space that a page happened to offer, ordinary people set down the cures they trusted, tucking their plant medicine into the corners of books kept for entirely other reasons. And because those host books were valued and protected for their own sake, the remedies riding quietly in their margins were protected too, carried down the centuries in the safest hiding place of all, which is plain sight. We must remember how precious a book was before the age of cheap paper and print. Every leaf was made from the skin of an animal, scraped and stretched and cut, and a single volume might represent a small herd and many weeks of labor. No one wasted so much as a corner of such a thing. The end leaves, the blank pages bound in at either end to protect the text, were fair game for any jotting, and the margins around the writing were broad enough to hold a note. And so the books of the age fill up, over the generations of their use, with all the small business of the lives that owned them, and among that business, again and again, are remedies. Open a family's prayer book, a psalter or a book of hours passed down through several generations, and you will often find, added in later and clumsier hands than the fine script of the main text, a scatter of cures, a remedy for a child's cough written in beside a psalm, a charm against toothache squeezed into the foot of a page of prayers, a receipt for a wound salve on the flyleaf, dated in some long past year, in the shaky hand of a grandmother who wished her daughters to have it after she was gone. The devotional book, kept and treasured and handed down with care, became, without anyone quite planning, it the family's medical book as well, the two kinds of comfort bound between the same covers. Sometimes the healing and the holy were joined even more closely than that, in objects that were half prayer and half remedy. There were long, narrow rolls of parchment, written over with prayers and the names of saints, and the measure of Christ's wounds, or of the holy nails, that a laboring woman would have wound about her body to ease and protect her in childbirth, a birth girdle carried from house to house, and lent from mother to mother across a whole parish. On such a roll the words themselves were the medicine, believed to comfort and to guard, and the same rolls often carried, folded in among the prayers, a charm or two against bleeding or against a hard labor. These strange and touching objects were treasured, handled with reverence, kept safe in a chest between the births they served. And so the healing words upon them came down the generations as surely as any book, protected by the holiness that clung to them. The same thing happened in books of a wholly practical kind. The account book of an estate, the register of a court, the ledger of a merchant, all of these gathered marginal cures as they passed through the hands of literate people who had somewhere to write and something worth remembering. A steward notes at the bottom of a page of expenses a good remedy for the murrain in cattle. A clerk sets down on the last leaf of a legal register the way to make a plaster for an aching back. These were people who wrote for a living, and when a useful cure came their way, they did the natural thing and wrote it where they could, in the book that lay open before them. Here is the quiet cleverness of it. Though no one thought of it as clever at the time, a remedy written on its own scrap of paper is a fragile thing, easily lost, easily thrown away, worth nothing to anyone but its owner. But a remedy written in the margin of a psalter is as safe as the psalter itself, and a psalter was among the last things a household would ever part with or destroy. The cure had, in effect, found itself a strong shelter to live in. No censer would burn a book of prayers to be rid of a charm in its margin. No fire lit against forbidden knowledge would be set to a book of accounts. The remedy survived because it clung to something no one wished to harm, and because these marginal cures were written by real people for real needs. They give us a truer glimpse of everyday healing than many a grander book. They are dated, personal, particular. A remedy is set down for my wife her cough, or against the ague that took the whole house last winter, or for the master his sore eyes. You can feel the household behind them. The sickness that prompted the writing, the hope that the cure would serve again. Where a formal herbal gives us the medicine of the schools, these jottings give us the medicine of the kitchen and the bedside, the actual reach of a family for the plants it trusted. The monasteries did the same in their own books. A monk copying out a psalter, or a book of the church might add, in the margin or on a spare leaf, a cure he had found useful, a note on a herb, a charm against fever, and these marginal additions in monastic manuscripts are among the richest sources we have for the everyday medicine of the cloister. The great formal herbals tell us what the monastery thought medicine ought to be. The scribbles in the margins tell us what the infirmary actually did on a cold morning when a brother was ill, and the two are not always quite the same. Out of all this marginal writing there grew, in time, a book of its own, the household commonplace book, the personal miscellany in which a literate family gathered everything it wished to keep. Here the remedies were no longer squeezed into the corners of some other work, but had a book to themselves, though a book that mingled them freely with all the rest of the household's concerns. A commonplace book might hold, on facing pages, a prayer and a cure for the colic, a favorite poem and a way to preserve plums, an account of a birth and a charm to stop bleeding, a note of a debt and a receipt for a cordial. It was a book of everything, kept by the mistress or the master of the house. And into it the family's plant medicine settled comfortably alongside its faith, its accounts and its pleasures. These household books were passed down like the psalters before them, mother to daughter above all, each new keeper adding her own cures in her own hand, until a single volume might carry the remedies of 4 or 5 generations, a slow accumulation of family healing written over decades. To read one now is to watch a household teach itself medicine across a century, the hands changing down the pages, the same cough remedy recopied and improved. A daughter noting beside her mother's receipt that she found it answered better with honey. Nothing here was forbidden. Nothing here was grand. It was simply the ordinary green medicine of a family, written down where it would last. For women above all, these blank leaves and marginal spaces were a doorway that the formal world of learning had shut, barred from the schools where medicine was taught, kept for the most part from the making of grand books. A literate woman could still keep her knowledge in the end leaves of a psalter or the pages of a household book, and there, quietly, she wrote. A great part of what survives to us of women's own healing knowledge, in their own words and their own hands, comes to us precisely from these humble places, from the margins and the receipt books, rather than from any printed volume under a woman's name. Shut out of the library, they wrote in the spaces the library had overlooked, and in doing so they kept alive a voice the formal record had done its best to quiet. It is a small triumph, easily missed, and worth pausing on tonight. There is a particular pleasure for us now in the cures that turn up in the most unlikely places, hidden not in margins, but in the very fabric of a book. When an old volume was bound, the binder often stiffened its covers and its spine with waste parchment, old pages no longer wanted, cut up and pasted in out of sight. And sometimes, when such a book is taken apart for mending centuries later, those hidden scraps turn out to be leaves of a medical manuscript, a fragment of some lost herbal or leech book, sliced up as mere packing and thereby, by pure accident, preserved. A remedy meant to be thrown away was saved by being buried inside the binding of a book about something else entirely, and waited there, unread for hundreds of years until a careful hand set it free. Even after print arrived, the old habit did not die, for the blank page kept its usefulness. Households bought printed almanacs, those small yearly books of dates and weather signs and phases of the moon, and interleaved them with blank sheets so that the master or mistress could set down, alongside the printed calendar, the family's own record of births and deaths, of debts and harvests, and, threaded among them, of cures given and remedies that had served. The blank leaves at the front of a printed Bible filled the same office, gathering the family's most treasured knowledge under the shelter of the most protected book of all. The remedy went on riding, as it always had, in the margins of something valued for another reason, only now the host book came off a press rather than out of a scriptorium. So the humblest and least protected remedies of all found, in the end, a kind of safety that the grandest books sometimes lack, too small to be worth banning, too useful to be thrown away. They hid in the margins and the end leaves and the very bindings of other books, and rode down the centuries on the coat, tales of prayer and law and account. It is one of the gentler lessons of our whole evening, that knowledge survives best, very often, not by standing proudly on its own, but by attaching itself quietly to something that no one wishes to destroy. For most of these long centuries, such household remedies stayed private, written for one family and read by no one else. But then came a change that took the quiet marginal cure and flung it, all at once, before thousands of readers. The printing press arrived, and with it a whole new kind of book, cheap and popular and hungry for exactly this sort of practical wisdom, and the private remedy stepped, for the first time, into the light of print. These were the books they called the books of secrets, and it is to them that we turn now. When the press came to Europe, it did not at first append the world of learning so much as pour out, in great cheap floods, exactly the things people had always wanted and never been able to afford. Among the most sought after of all were books of practical knowledge, and chief among those were the collections that went by the name of secrets, printed gatherings of recipes and remedies and household arts that a middling family could at last own for a modest price. The remedy that had once hidden in the margin of a psalter now stood in a printed book on a stationer's stall, one of hundreds, offered to anyone with a few coins and the wish to try it. What these books contained was very like the old commonplace book, only printed and offered to all. A single volume might teach you how to make a wound salve and a scented water, how to dye cloth and take a stain from linen, how to preserve fruit and brew a cordial for a weak stomach, how to work small wonders with a lodestone, and how to ease a toothache, all jumbled together under the single alluring word secret. The secrets were the hidden virtues of things, the useful knacks and cures that a craftsman or a wise housewife might know and a stranger would not. Now set down in plain print for the whole reading public to share. The most famous of them all appeared in Venice in the middle of the 16th century, under the name of a certain gentleman said to have travelled the world gathering rare cures. Whether the man behind the name was real or a convenient fiction hardly mattered to the book's success, for it was enormous. It was reprinted again and again, and translated out of its first Italian into Latin, French, English, German, and Spanish, until scarcely a corner of literate Europe was without it. Its recipes for salves and waters and remedies passed into countless households and countless other books. And for a lifetime and more, it was among the most widely owned books of practical medicine anywhere on the continent. Its readers were not only physicians and apprentices, but, in great numbers, the mistresses of households, and the printers were quick to see it. Before long there appeared books shaped directly for the gentlewoman and the housewife, closets and cabinets of choice receipts, delights for ladies, whole volumes of distilled waters and conserves and sweetmeats and cures set out for the woman who ran a still and a still room of her own. Here the private knowledge that women had so long kept in their household books came full circle and returned to them in print, gathered and offered back for a price. The lady who had learned her cordials at her mother's side could now buy a printed book of them compare its receipts with her own, and copy the best into the family volume. And the old handed-down learning and the new printed kind flowed together on her shelf. A great many of these secrets turned upon the art of distilling, which the age loved above almost any other, seeing in it a way to draw out the very soul of a plant. The books taught the reader to set herbs and flowers in a still over a gentle fire, to catch the fragrant water that rose and dripped from the beak of the vessel, and to keep these distilled waters as concentrated medicines, the captured virtue of the plant in liquid form. To distill a herb was, in the language of the age, to release its hidden secret, its inner power drawn free of the coarse leaf that had held it, and a whole shelf of such waters became the pride of many a stillroom. Here the very word that named the genre, the secret, met the very craft that filled it, the slow, patient drawing forth of what lay hidden inside a common plant. Now, that word secret carried a certain shadow with it, and this is where our story rejoins its theme. To call a thing a secret was to say it held a hidden power, a virtue not plain to the eye, and hidden powers were precisely what made the guardians of learning uneasy. A remedy that worked by a plain and known cause was one thing. A secret that worked by some concealed virtue drawn from the stars or the deep properties of nature was another, for it stood close to the borderland of magic. And the same suspicion the Church had long felt toward the charm now fell, a little, upon the printed book that promised marvels. Most of what these books held was harmless enough. Distilled waters and herb salves and kitchen cures, but the promise of the hidden and the marvelous hung about the whole genre, and gave it a faintly dangerous glamour. Woven through many of them, too, was the old entanglement of medicine with the stars. A remedy might come with directions, to gather its herbs under a certain planet, to prepare it in a certain hour of the sky, to give it when the moon stood in a favoring sign. To the makers of these books this was not superstition, but a branch of natural knowledge, the belief that the heavens poured their influences down into the plants and the body, and that a wise healer worked in time with them. But Star, reading medicine, drew the eye of the authorities, for it shaded easily into the reading of fates and fortunes that the Church firmly condemned, and a book that mixed cures with the courses of the planets could find itself watched more closely for it. In the Catholic lands especially, this closer watching sometimes left its mark on the very pages. A book of secrets that mingled sound remedies with charms, with star lore, or with prayers that strayed too near the shape of a spell, might be allowed to go on circulating only after the doubtful passages had been struck out or amended, the offending lines inked over, or simply left unprinted in the next edition. A reader comparing two printings of the same popular book might find a charm quietly gone from the later one, or an astrological direction softened into a plain instruction, the work tidied to pass the eye of the licensers. Rarely was such a book banned outright. More often it was gently corrected, its stranger secrets trimmed away, so that what remained could keep its place on the stall without giving offense. The deeper unease, though, was simpler and more human. Print had let knowledge slip its old leash. For 1,000 years the plant medicine of the learned had lived behind Latin and behind the walls of the school and the cloister, in the keeping of physicians and priests. Now it stood in the vernacular on an open stall, and any literate person, gentleman or goodwife or apprentice, could buy a book of secrets, take it home, and try its cures without asking leave of any physician or any priest. To those who had held that knowledge, this was an unsettling thing, and some of their disquiet at the books of secrets was really disquiet at the loss of their own quiet, monopoly over healing. One man drew this suspicion to a point. In Naples, a gentleman of great curiosity gathered about him a small circle of like-minded friends who met to investigate the hidden workings of nature, the secret virtues of plants and stones and living things, and he wrote them up in a celebrated book of natural magic that ran through many editions across Europe. By natural magic he meant no dealing with spirits, only the study and use of the powers that God had hidden in the natural world. But the very name was enough to draw the notice of the church authorities, and it is recorded that his little academy of the secrets of nature was looked into, and, it was said, required to disband, and that his writings were examined before he was allowed to go on. He was no sorcerer, only a keen student of the world, but he had strayed near enough to the forbidden border that the guardians felt they must take a look. We should not overstate it. No great burning of the books of secrets ever took place, and most of them went on being printed and read and used quite freely, for they were far too useful and too popular to suppress. But their story marks a real turn in our long evening. With print, the private remedy became public, and the public remedy became, for the first time, something the authorities felt they had a duty to watch. The margin of the psalter had hidden the cure from all notice. The printed book of secrets shouted it from the stall, and by shouting it, drew upon the whole world of plant medicine a scrutiny it had largely escaped while it stayed quietly in the corners of other books. And in the very years when these popular books were pouring from the presses, a single furious physician was setting the whole ancient framework of medicine on its head, burning the books of the old masters in the public square and drawing to himself a suspicion deeper than any book of secrets ever earned. His name has come down to us as Paracelsus, and it is to him and to the strange world of the star, reading physicians, that we turn now. In the early 16th century, there strode across the medicine of Europe one of the strangest and most quarrelsome figures in its whole long history, a man who did as much as anyone to overturn the old learning, and who drew upon himself by the end a suspicion as deep as any book of secrets ever earned. He was born in the Swiss lands and named Theophrastus, but he took for himself a prouder name, meaning that he stood beyond even the great physicians of ancient Rome, and it is by that boastful name, Paracelsus, that we remember him. He is worth an hour of our evening, for in him the whole tangle of forbidden knowledge, folk remedy, star lore, and new learning comes to a single sharp point. He was a wanderer by nature, restless and rough-tongued, who spent his life tramping the roads of Europe and refused to sit still in any university chair for long. He had studied the schools, but he came to despise them, and he made a point of learning his medicine, not from the professors, but from the people the professors looked down upon. He talked with barber surgeons and with miners about the diseases of their trade, with old women and midwives and village healers about their herbs and their charms, gathering the hand one plant knowledge of the common folk with a respect that scandalized his learned colleagues. The wise woman whose knowledge the schools ignored found, in this wild traveling doctor, an unexpected champion, for he held that she often knew more of real healing than all the masters of the faculty put together. His contempt for the old authorities came to a head in a single famous act. Holding a post for a time at Basel, he is said to have gathered the great medical books of the ancients, the works of the old Greek, and the great Arabic master that every physician revered, and thrown them into a student's bonfire lit for the midsummer feast, letting the pages that had ruled medicine for 1,000 years curl and blacken in the flames. It was a bold and public gesture, a burning of books by a physician who wished the whole weight of the past lifted from the sickbed, and it made him as many enemies as any man could wish for. Here, for once, the fire was lit not by the church against forbidden knowledge, but by a reformer against the knowledge that had grown too settled and too proud. What he wished to put in the place of the old books was experience, the direct reading of nature herself. The true physician, he taught, must go to the mountains and the fields and the sick beds and learn from them, must know the plant by handling it and the disease by watching it, and must trust what he found there over anything written by a dead authority. In this he pointed, however wildly, toward a newer way of knowing, one that would in time reshape all of medicine. And it is part of his strangeness that the same man who burned the old books also helped to found a new and more questioning kind of learning. Yet his own reading of nature was anything but plain, for he saw the whole world as a web of hidden correspondences, and this is where he draws close to our theme of forbidden things. He held to the old belief that God had marked each healing plant with a visible sign of the use he intended for it, so that a wise eye could read the cure in the very shape and color of the herb. A plant whose leaf was spotted like a diseased lung was given for the lungs. A flower with a bright eye at its center was meant for the eyes. A nut folded like the brain within its shell was food for the head. This reading of the marks of things, this doctrine of signatures, as it came to be called, turned the whole green world into a book of divine hints, waiting to be deciphered by the humble and the watchful. He held, too, that the stars poured their influences down into the herbs and the body, and that no one could be a true physician who was not also a reader of the heavens. Man, in his seeing, was a little world, a small mirror of the great world above, and every organ answered to a planet, and every herb to a star, so that to heal the body was to bring the little world back into tune with the great one. This was the old astral medicine, raised to its highest pitch, and it bound his healing tightly to a knowledge of the sky that the church, for its own reasons, watched with a narrowed eye. And there was more still, for he wedded his medicine to the old art of alchemy, turning its furnaces and its distillations from the chasing of gold to the making of remedies. He sought to draw off the pure inner virtue of a plant or a mineral, its very quintessence, by fire and distillation, and to give it as a concentrated medicine. And in this he stood at the fountainhead of a whole new chemical physic that would grow mighty in the centuries after him. His remedies of prepared minerals and distilled essences were strange and sometimes dangerous, but they were new, and they carried medicine a long step away from the simple herb infusions of the past. All of this together, the burning of the old masters, the honoring of folk charms, the reading of signatures and stars, the alchemical furnace, made Paracelsus a deeply suspect figure to nearly everyone in authority. The physicians hated him for overthrowing their Galen and insulting their learning. The theologians eyed him for his mysticism, his own unorthodox turn of religion, and his free mingling of magic, astrology, and healing into a single vision that fitted no approved mold. He was, in the fullest sense, a maker of dangerous books, and it is little wonder that so many of them appeared in print only after his death, gathered up and defended by devoted followers who saw in him a prophet, while his enemies saw only a drunken magician. Very little of his own work reached print while he lived. One book of surgery found its way to the press in his lifetime and was widely read, but the great mass of his writing, his strange and difficult meditations on medicine and nature and God, lay in manuscript until after he was gone, and only then poured out in edition after edition to feed the movement that gathered in his name. Among the remedies he left was a preparation of opium that he praised above almost all others for the easing of pain, a tincture he called by a name that has echoed down the centuries, and in this at least the wild reformer gave a plain and lasting gift, for the quieting of suffering was a thing he took with great seriousness beneath all his thunder. His own life ran out early and alone. After his years of wandering, he came at last to the city of Salzburg, and there, still only in his middle 40s, he died, leaving behind him a scatter of manuscripts, a fierce reputation, and a legend that grew quickly in the telling. It was said that he carried always at his side a great sword, and that, in its heavy pommel, he kept the secret of his most powerful medicine, so that he slept with his hand upon the hilt. Whatever the truth of it, the image is a fitting one for the man, the lonely healer on the road, his whole strange science close about him, trusting no library but the one he carried in his own restless head. Those followers, the Paracelsians, carried his ideas across Europe and turned them into a whole movement, a school of star reading, chemistry mixing physicians who reworked medicine along his lines. Some of them were careful and gifted men who did real good, refining his chemical remedies and pushing medicine toward a more searching study of nature. Others were dreamers and quacks who took the wildest parts of his teaching and ran with them. Around the whole movement there hung a permanent cloud of suspicion, for it carried, wherever it went, that troubling mixture of sound new medicine with astrology, alchemy, and heterodox belief, exactly the mixture that made the guardians of both learning and faith uneasy. Out of all this quarreling there grew a long and stubborn war within medicine itself, between the followers of the old Galen and the followers of the new chemistry, that ran on for well over a century after Paracelsus was in his grave. The learned faculties, guarding the ancient teaching, set their faces against the new mineral remedies, and in more than one great city, the prepared metals and chemical medicines of the Paracelsians were condemned outright by the doctors of the schools, forbidden to be given, argued over in pamphlet and lecture with a heat that seems strange to us now. Yet slowly, remedy by remedy, the new physic won its place, until the distilled essences and prepared minerals that had once been the mark of a dangerous heretic sat quietly on the shelves of the most respectable apothecary. The forbidden medicine of one generation became the ordinary practice of the next, as forbidden things so often do. It is worth pausing before we leave him on the double thing that Paracelsus was. He was at once a destroyer and a maker of endangered books, a man who threw the old authorities into the fire and then wrote new works so strange that they too fell under a shadow. And in one respect at least he did a lasting service to the very knowledge we have followed all evening. For by honoring the plant lore of the wise woman and the village healer, by insisting that their hand-won knowledge was worth more than the professors allowed, he lifted their despised learning, for a moment, into the light of print and serious argument. The knowledge the schools had ignored found, in this quarrelsome wanderer, a strange and stormy advocate. But his marriage of medicine to the stars and the spirits drew the attention of the most famous book watcher in the whole of our story. The great list of forbidden books drawn up in Rome, upon which the works of the star-reading physicians, and much else besides, would in time find their place. It is to that list, the index, that we turn now. We come now to the thing that most people think of first, when they hear of books the Church tried to erase, the famous Roman list of forbidden books, the index. It has gathered to itself, over the centuries, a great deal of dark legend, and part of the quiet work of tonight is to set it gently in its true place, neither smaller nor larger than it was. For the index was real, and it was powerful within its own world, and yet its bearing on the plant medicine we have followed was far lighter and far stranger than the legend would have it. It came into being in the middle of the 16th century, in Rome, in the years when the Western Church had been torn in two by the Reformation and was fighting hard to hold its people. The index was a printed list, drawn up under the authority of the popes and revised again and again down the generations, naming the books that faithful Catholics were forbidden to print, sell, or read. A special body of churchmen was set up to keep it, to judge new books, and to decide what should be added and what might be allowed. For centuries it shaped what could be read across the Catholic lands of Europe, and its long life did not finally end until well into modern times. Its great purpose, we must be clear, was not medicine at all. It was aimed above everything at heresy, at the writings of the Reformers, the Protestant Bibles and sermons and works of theology that Rome held to be poison to the soul. Plant medicine, the herbal and the Leechbook and the receipt of cures, was simply not what the index was made to fight. And yet, precisely because it was so broad a net, cast across the whole world of print, it could not help but catch some medical books in its edges, and the ways it caught them are worth our quiet attention. The commonest way was through the faith of the author, rather than the content of the book. A great many of the finest naturalists and physicians of the age happened to be Protestants, men of the German and Swiss reforming lands, and the index forbade the works of such men wholesale, the good with the bad, the harmless with the heretical. So it came about that a magnificent herbal, a careful and beautiful study of plants and their virtues, might be forbidden to Catholic readers, not for a single word of its botany, which was blameless, but purely because the man who made it had taken the reformers' side in religion. A whole flowering of plant knowledge fell under the shadow of the list, banned for its maker's beliefs, while its actual pages held nothing but the honest description of herbs. This happened, as it chanced, to some of the very greatest plant books of the age. In the German lands, in the same reforming years, there worked a small group of men, now remembered as the fathers of botany. who set aside the worn old copied pictures and drew the plants afresh from life, making herbals of a truth and beauty the world had not seen before. Their books were triumphs of careful observation, and they were also, every one of them, the work of men of the Reformed faith, and so in the Catholic lands they fell under the ban or the cleaning knife. A reader in Rome or Madrid might be allowed such a herbal only after its dedication to some Protestant prince had been struck out, its praises of the reformers inked away, its author's name perhaps quietly dropped, leaving the plants themselves untouched upon the page. The flower was innocent. Only the hand that drew it, and the faith that hand professed, had given offense. Then there was the old entanglement of medicine with magic and the stars, which we have met again and again tonight, and which the index treated firmly. A famous book of hidden philosophy, a great gathering of the secret virtues of plants and stones, and the influences of the heavens, and the workings of ceremonial magic, was placed among the forbidden. And with it much of the tradition of natural magic that had drawn so near to medicine. The works of the star-reading physicians, the followers of Paracelsus, with their mingling of alchemy, astrology, and unorthodox belief, drew condemnation as well, so that here the index and the plant medicine of our story truly did cross paths, though it was the magic and the star lore, not the herbs, that gave offense. The reading of the future by the stars was condemned outright by a solemn decree of one of the popes against those who claimed to foretell what was to come by the courses of the heavens. This mattered to medicine, for medical astrology had long walked a fine line, and now it had to walk it carefully. To say that a certain herb worked best gathered under a certain planet, or that the body answered to the sky, was tolerated as a kind of natural knowledge. But to cross over into foretelling a man's fate, his fortune or his death, by the stars was forbidden, and the physician who leaned too far toward prophecy in his star reading could find himself in trouble he had not looked for. Yet here we come to the gentlest and most important truth about the index, the one the legend most often forgets. Its favored tool, more often than outright banning, was correction. Alongside the list of forbidden books, there grew up lists of books to be expurgated, that is, cleaned, and a book on this second list was not to be destroyed at all, but only to have its offending passages struck out, inked over, or left unprinted, after which the cleaned book might be kept and read quite lawfully. A Catholic reader's copy of some suspect work might come down to us with a few lines heavily crossed through by an obedient hand, the rest perfectly whole and perfectly usable. The aim, very often, was not to erase the book, but to save it by mending it, to keep the useful body and cut away only the doubtful limb. This cleaning fitted into a larger machinery that governed all printing in the Catholic lands, for there a book could not lawfully be set in type at all until it had been read and approved, and its license to be printed was set at the front of the volume for all to see. A herbal or a book of physic passed, like every other, before an appointed reader who might pass it freely, or pass it with corrections, or refuse it. Most books of plants sailed through without trouble, for there was nothing in the naming of herbs to trouble a licenser, and the whole apparatus fell far more heavily on theology than on medicine. But it meant that every printed cure in those lands had, in principle, been looked over by an official eye, and that the making of a book was never quite the private act it had been, when a healer scratched her remedy in the margin of a psalter. In daily practice, the whole system was far looser than its stern face suggested. A learned physician who needed a forbidden book for his work could often gain a license to keep and read it. Scholars, churchmen, and doctors held permissions to own what ordinary readers could not. And beyond all this lay the plainest limit of all, that the index was a Catholic instrument and had force only in Catholic lands. In the Protestant cities of the north, in the great printing towns where the book fairs were held, the very works Rome forbade were set in type and sold openly, and a determined reader anywhere in Europe could usually lay hands on a banned book if he truly wished to. A herbal forbidden in Rome sat on the shelves of Frankfurt and Basel without the least trouble. The list itself grew and grew across the centuries, swelling into a great catalogue of forbidden titles that was reprinted and revised again and again down the generations, and it endured, in one form or another, for something close to 400 years, before it was at last set aside in modern times. That is a very long life for a book of banned books, and it is easy, looking back across so many centuries of it, to imagine a single unbroken war upon knowledge. But the truer picture is quieter and more patchwork than that. The great bulk of what it forbade was always religious. The plant books it touched glancingly and for reasons that had little to do with their herbs, and it touched them, most often, with the cleaning knife rather than the fire, in one half of a divided continent, while the other half printed freely on. So let us hold the index in its true proportion, without either excusing or inflating it. It was not a war upon healing. It was a net cast for heresy in a bitterly divided age, and it caught some medical books at its edges, mostly for the faith of their authors, or for their dabbling in magic and the stars, and even those it caught it more often cleaned than destroyed. While beyond its reach the same books were freely printed and sold. There is no dark conspiracy here against the knowledge of the herbs, only the ordinary friction of a broken Christendom in which a book of plants could be forbidden in one city and treasured in the next. But there was one country where a change of religion fell upon the medical books, not at the light edge, but with its full weight, where whole libraries that had preserved the plant learning of 1,000 years were broken up in a single generation and scattered to the winds. It happened in England, when the monasteries were dissolved, and it is to that great breaking of the libraries that we turn now. We turn now to a loss unlike any we have spoken of so far, for it was not the work of any censor or any list, and no one who carried it out was thinking of the plant medicine at all. It was the greatest single destruction of books in the whole history of these islands, and it fell upon the medical learning of England not by design but almost by accident, as the by-product of a quarrel about quite other things. It was the breaking of the monasteries, and with them the breaking of their libraries. When the King of England broke with Rome and made himself the head of his own church, he turned his eye upon the monasteries, those ancient, wealthy houses of monks and nuns, and across a few short years in the later 1530s and the early 1540s they were closed, one after another, their lands seized, their treasures taken, their communities scattered. Hundreds of houses that had stood for centuries were emptied in a single generation, and a whole world went quiet that had never known silence in living memory. For our story, the heart of the matter was the libraries. We have spent much of our evening in the copying rooms of the monasteries, watching the monks preserve the old plant medicine faithfully across 1,000 years. And it was in these same houses that the greatest gatherings of books in all of England were kept. The monastic libraries were the nation's memory, and among their volumes lay the Herbals and the Leechbooks, the receipts and the medical manuscripts, the accumulated healing knowledge of centuries, copied and recopied by exactly the patient hands we honored earlier tonight. When the houses fell, those libraries were simply scattered to the winds. There was no order given to preserve them, no care taken to gather them into safety, and so they were broken up and dispersed in whatever careless way the moment allowed. A few books were saved by men who valued them. The great mass were not. Volumes that had taken a monk half a year to copy were now worth less than the boards and the leather that bound them, and they were treated accordingly, as so much waste to be got rid of or put to some baser use. We have, from a man who lived through it and grieved over it, a description of what became of the books that has never been bettered for its plain horror. He tells us that those who took over the monastic buildings kept the old library volumes for the most ordinary and humiliating of purposes. Some were used to scar candlesticks, some to rub the mud from boots, some were sold off to the grocers and the soap sellers to wrap their wares, and some were shipped overseas to the bookbenders. Not a few at a time, but, as he says, whole ships full at once, sent abroad to be cut up for their parchment. 1,000 years of careful copying ended as wrapping paper and boot rags and packing for the crossing to the Low Countries. That mention of the bookbinders points to one of the strangest afterlives of these ruined books, and one that has, by pure chance, preserved a little of what was lost. Binders of the time used old parchment to stiffen the covers and spines of new volumes, and so the scattered leaves of the monastic manuscripts, cut and folded and pasted out of sight, went on to line the bindings of countless later books. To this day, when an old volume of that period is taken apart for mending, the packing hidden in its covers now and then turns out to be a fragment of a medieval herbal or leech book, a stray leaf of the very knowledge that was being thrown away, saved without anyone meaning to save it, buried inside the binding of a book about something else. One man tried, almost alone, to stem the loss. The king had a scholar in his service whose task was to travel the length of the land recording what the libraries held. And as the houses began to fall, he went from monastery to monastery in something close to desperation, listing their books, carrying off what he could, pleading for the rest to be spared. He saw more clearly than almost anyone what was vanishing, and the seeing of it seems to have been more than he could bear, for in his later years his mind gave way, and he ended his days lost to the grief and the labor of it. His notebooks survive, and they are a roll call of treasures, many of which we know only from his hurried lists, because the books themselves were gone within the year. What England lost in medicine we can never fully count, precisely because it was lost. Herbals painted and copied over centuries, collections of remedies gathered from every corner of Christendom, the working medical libraries of the great infirmaries, all of it went into the general ruin. We know the monasteries had been the chief keepers of this knowledge. We know their libraries were destroyed, And so we know, though we can never list them, that a great number of the plant medicine books of medieval England simply ceased to exist in those few years, leaving gaps in the record that no later discovery can ever quite fill. Some of the houses that fell had held libraries famous throughout the land. There was one great abbey in the West Country, among the oldest and richest in the kingdom, whose collection of books had been gathered and cherished for many hundreds of years, and was reckoned one of the finest anywhere in England. When that house was dissolved, and its last abbot met a hard end, its library went the way of all the rest, broken up and carried off and lost, and of the countless volumes it had held only a scattered handful can now be traced in the collections of the world. What medicine lay among those lost books, what herbals and receipts and infirmary records, we shall never know, for they went down together with the poetry and the history and the theology into the same general dark, and the abbey that had kept them safe for 1,000 years could keep them no longer. The living gardens went the way of the written ones. The physic gardens that had grown beside the infirmaries, the ordered beds of healing herbs, tended by the monks across so many generations, were dug up, built over, or left to run wild once the hands that kept them were gone. A garden, like a book, must be tended to survive, and when the community that tended it was scattered, its careful plantings returned to weed and grass, and the particular knowledge of which herb grew in which bed, and how it was used, faded from the place along with the men who had held it. Not everything vanished, of course. Some monks, leaving their houses, carried a treasured book or two away with them into their new lives. Some volumes were bought up by gentlemen who happened to value them, or passed into the hands of the growing universities, or were quietly kept by the families who took over the monastic lands. But this saving was almost entirely a matter of chance, of one man's whim or another's greed, with no plan behind it, and no thought for what mattered most. A book survived because someone happened to fancy it, and 100 others perished because no one did, and there was no reason in any of it, only luck. And yet, even in the midst of the ruin, the work of rescue had already quietly begun. Within a generation of the great scattering, there were men who saw what had been lost and set themselves to gather up what remained, riding about the country, buying old manuscripts from whoever now held them, collecting the loose leaves and orphaned volumes of the broken houses into private libraries, where they might at least be safe. One churchman of high place made it his particular care to seek out and preserve the surviving medieval books, and much that would otherwise have perished came down to us, because he gathered it in those years and left it, in the end, to a college that keeps it still. The saving was partial, and it came too late for the greater part of what was lost, but it was a beginning, and it is worth holding on to the thought that the same age which broke the libraries also produced the first men who grieved for them and worked to save their remnant. And it was not England alone. Across the whole of Europe, in the same age of religious division and war, say monastic and other libraries were scattered and burned as the tides of faith and armies rolled back and forth. Where the Reformation took hold, houses fell and books were lost much as they were in England. Where wars were fought over religion, libraries went up in the general burning of towns. The breaking of the English monasteries was the largest and best remembered of these losses. but it was one among many, part of a wider fraying of the old stored knowledge across a continent tearing itself apart. There is a particular sadness to this kind of loss, and it is worth naming gently before we move on. The censor who strikes a line from a book at least values the book enough to correct it. The keeper of the index at least reads what he forbids. But the men who scoured their candlesticks with the leaves of a herbal were not censoring anything. They simply did not see that the book was worth keeping at all. This is the quietest and most complete kind of erasure, the loss of knowledge that no one even troubles to destroy, that is thrown away as rubbish by people who have forgotten or never knew what it was. It asks no outrage of us, only a kind of sorrow, and perhaps a little gratitude for the few leaves that survived by hiding in the bindings of other books. Yet even in the midst of this great scattering, the knowledge found ways to slip quietly to safety, as it always had. It went where it had always gone in times of danger, out of the grand institution and into the private home, out of the great library and into the small handwritten book kept on a kitchen shelf. For while the monastic libraries were being broken up, the households of England were keeping books of their own, humble, personal, and beneath all notice, and into these the old remedies quietly passed. It is to the household book, that quiet ark of a family's healing, that we turn now. While the great libraries burned and scattered, a very different kind of book sat unregarded on the shelves of ordinary houses, and it turned out to be far harder to destroy. It was the household receipt book, the family's own handwritten gathering of remedies and recipes, kept by the mistress of the house and added to across the generations, and in the age of broken libraries and watched printers it became one of the surest hiding places the old plant knowledge ever found. Nearly every household of any substance kept such a book, and many humbler ones did too. It was a plain manuscript volume, written in the family's own hands, in which were set down the things worth remembering, and chief among them were the cures: a receipt for a wound salve, a syrup for a winter cough, a water for sore eyes, a plaster for an aching joint, all copied in as they were learned and tried, mixed freely with receipts for cooking and brewing and the keeping of a house. It was a working book, stained and corrected, the very opposite of a grand library volume, and precisely because of that it slipped beneath every net that was cast for dangerous knowledge. For this book was private, handwritten, and answerable to no one. No licenser read it before it was made, for it was never printed. No censor struck lines from it, for it never came to a censor's notice. No index could list it, for there was only one copy in all the world, on a single family shelf. It was free, as no printed book could be, to hold whatever its keeper wished to keep, and so it held things that the printed books of the age had grown too cautious to carry. Because of this freedom, the household book became a refuge for exactly the older, stranger remedies that were being quietly dropped from print, a charm against bleeding that no printer would now set in type could still be copied into a family book without a second thought. A cure once learned from the monks, a saint's remedy, an old blessing over a herb, survived in these domestic pages long after it had vanished from the public shelves. What the age was cleaning out of its printed medicine, the household book quietly kept, tucked between a cake and a cordial where no one thought to look. This mattered most of all in the households that had held to the old faith. When England turned Protestant, there remained families who kept, in secret, the Catholic religion of their fathers, hiding their priests in the walls and their beliefs behind closed doors. In such houses the old devotional world lived on in private, and with it the old devotional medicine, the remedies tied to saints and blessings and holy days that the new church frowned upon, written into a family receipt book or simply held in memory and passed down. These old ways survived within the household long after they had been driven from public life, one more secret among the secrets such families were used to keeping. Some of the monastic knowledge itself came down by this domestic road. The families who took over the lands and buildings of the broken monasteries sometimes kept more than the stones. They kept the fish ponds and the orchards the monks had planted, the herb beds gone half wild, and now and then a book or a remedy that had belonged to the house, so that a monastic cure might pass into the receipt book of the very family that now lived where the monks had lived. In this quiet way, a thread of the old infirmary knowledge was carried on in local hands, cut off from the institution that had grown it, but not quite lost. The keepers of these books were, overwhelmingly, women. It was the mistress of the household who compiled the family's remedies, who tried them and corrected them and taught them to her daughters, and who passed the book itself down the female line as one of the household's true treasures. Here again, as in the margins of the psalters, the healing knowledge of women found a home that the formal world of learning had denied it. And here it was not squeezed into a corner, but given a whole book of its own, kept and guarded and handed on with pride. Some of these women were healers of real depth, tending not only their own households, but whole neighborhoods around them. There was one gentlewoman of the age who left behind a great mass of medical writing, many hundreds of pages of remedies and observations, gathered patiently across a long life, in which she set down the cures she had tried and the cases she had treated with the care of any physician. She dosed her family and her servants and the poor of her district, kept her own store of medicines, and wrote it all down so fully that we can follow her practice almost day by day. She held no license and no place in any faculty, and yet her book of physics stands as complete and as thoughtful as many a printed work by the learned men who would never have admitted a woman to their number. Such keepers turned the household book from a mere kitchen memorandum into a serious record of healing. To turn the pages of such a book now is to see the whole texture of a household's life laid out without division. A remedy for the stone sits beside a way to candy oranges, a charm to stop bleeding faces, a receipt for a rich cake, a prayer, a cure, a note of a birth, a way to keep meat sweet through the summer, all written in together as they came. For the woman who kept the book saw no reason to sort the healing of the body from the feeding of it, or the comfort of the soul. It is a picture of medicine as it truly was for most people. Not a separate science, but one strand in the ordinary weave of keeping a family alive and well. These books were not kept in isolation either, for the women who made them formed a wide and quiet network of exchange. A good receipt was a thing to be shared, and gentlewomen copied cures for one another, sent remedies by letter, gave a favorite receipt as a gift, so that a single successful salve might travel from house to house across a whole county, gathering the names of the women who had passed it along. In this way the household books, for all that each was private, were joined into a great informal web of shared knowledge, a library with no building, spread across 1,000 kitchen shelves and held together by friendship and letters. Many of these books survive, and they are among the most touching records we have of how people actually healed themselves. A receipt will carry a note in the margin that this salve cured my lady of a sore leg, or that this water was had from such a neighbor who found it very good, the whole history of a remedies trial written into the book beside it. Occasionally, folded in among the cures, one finds an old charm or a scrap of the forbidden past, kept for the same reason as everything else, because someone had found it useful and did not wish to lose it. In time, some of this domestic knowledge found its own way back into print, closing the circle once more. After the death of a certain great lady renowned for her cures, the book of her choice remedies was gathered up and printed, and it proved so welcome that it was reissued again and again for many years, carrying her household physic to readers far beyond the reach of her own kitchen. Here a body of remedies that had lived first in manuscript, handed about among gentlewomen, and copied from book to book, stepped at last onto the public shelf under a noblewoman's name, and by doing so preserved in fixed print a great deal of the older, homelier plant medicine that the more cautious learned books had let fall. The private and the printed, the manuscript and the press, kept passing the knowledge back and forth between them, and at each passing a little more of it was saved. There is a deep lesson in the survival of these humble books, and it is the same lesson we met in the margins, now grown to the size of a whole volume. An institution, however great, can be broken in a single year, its library scattered, its knowledge dispersed beyond recovery. But a family book, copied and handed down from mother to daughter across the generations, is a far harder thing to kill, for it lives in too many hands and hides in too plain a sight. The knowledge that the great libraries lost, the small household books quietly kept, and carried it forward through every upheaval of a turbulent age. Yet there was one road by which the old plant knowledge survived that was stranger and sadder than any household shelf, a road along which a remedy came down to us not because a friend wrote it lovingly in a family book, but because an enemy wrote it coldly in a court record, as evidence against the woman who knew it. It is to that strange preservation, the charm saved by the very court that condemned its keeper, that we turn now. Of all the roads by which the old plant knowledge came down to us, there is one that is stranger and sadder than any other, and we must walk it gently tonight. For a certain number of the oldest charms and folk remedies survive to us in only one written form, and that form is the record of a trial. They were set down not by a friend who loved them, but by a clerk of the court who was building a case against the woman who knew them, written into the papers of her condemnation as the very evidence against her. The knowledge outlived its keeper, preserved by the hand that helped to destroy her. We have spoken already of the village healer and the fine line she walked. Loved and needed by her neighbors in good times, she stood always a little apart, a little suspect, the woman who knew things others did not, whose cures worked by means not everyone understood. In most places and most years this ambiguity did her no harm at all. She was consulted, paid in eggs and thread, respected for her skill, and died at last in her own bed full of years. But the same knowledge that made her valued could, in a bad season, make her feared, and now and then that fear turned against her. It took little to turn it. A run of misfortune in the village, a child dead, a cow gone dry, a harvest failed, and frightened people looked about for a cause. And the woman who dealt in unseen powers was near at hand. A jealous neighbor, an old grudge, a careless word. And the healer who had been welcome at every sickbed might find herself instead brought before the authorities to answer for the very arts that had made her useful. In the anxious centuries, when such trials were most common, this was a real danger, though we should be careful, even here, not to paint the whole age in the colors of its worst moments. For it must be said plainly that this was never the common fate. The great majority of the cunning folk, the healers who worked with herb and charm, lived out their lives entirely untroubled by any court, plying their quiet trade with the tacit tolerance of everyone around them, including, very often, the local clergy and gentry who consulted them as readily as anyone else. The trials, terrible as they were, fell upon a small number, and for every healer brought before a court, there were countless others who never were. We speak of the trials tonight not to darken the whole picture, but because of the strange thing they did with the knowledge, quite against their own intention. And that strange thing was this: to condemn a healer for her charms, a court first had to prove what her charms were, and to prove them it had to record them. So the clerk wrote down, in careful detail, exactly what the accused had said and done, the words of the charm spoken over the wound, the herbs gathered and how the ritual followed at the bedside, all set out in full so that the court might judge them. The very thoroughness of the prosecution required that the forbidden words be written plainly, and so they were, preserved for all time in the one document whose whole purpose was to end the practice they described. There is a deep irony in this that is worth pausing on. For centuries the Church had labored to soften and christen and quietly change the old charms, and in doing so had left us mostly baptized versions, the heathen invocation swapped for a holy one. But in the trial record the charm often survives raw and whole, taken down word for word from the mouth of the healer herself, because the court wanted the plain truth of what she said, not a corrected version of it. The place where the old words were most fully written down, in the end, was the place where they were most fiercely condemned, and so a great deal of what we now know about the actual spoken medicine of ordinary people comes to us from these hostile pages. Charms to staunch bleeding, to cure a fever, to charm away a wart or an egg. Rituals for gathering a healing herb, blessings said over a sick beast. All of these survive in the depositions and confessions and the printed accounts of famous trials, copied down by enemies and thereby saved. The scholar who wishes to hear the real voice of the village charm must often go, of all places, to the records of the courts that tried to silence it. There were cheap printed pamphlets, too, that carried the notorious trials to a wide and eager public, telling the tale of some famous case in lurid detail for the penny it would earn. In their eagerness to shock, these pamphlets set down the healer's charms and cures at length, and so, while meaning only to horrify or entertain, they preserved and even spread the very words they condemned, carrying an old blood, charm into print on the back of the trial that was meant to end it. The knowledge travelled onward, as knowledge does, indifferent to the intentions of those who moved it. Now and then, in these records, we catch the healer's own voice, with a clearness we find almost nowhere else. Asked where she had learned her cures, a woman answers that she had them of her mother, or of an old woman now dead. And in that plain reply we hear the whole unwritten chain of teaching we spoke of earlier, named at last, if only because a court demanded it. Asked how her charm worked, she explains it in her own words, and for a moment, across all the centuries and all the hostility of the setting, we hear a village healer speak directly of her craft, a thing that almost never happens anywhere else in the whole record. There is a quiet wonder in setting these charms, taken down at a trial, beside the ones written into the old Leechbooks a full 1,000 years before. Again and again they prove to be the same. The blood charm that names the river Jordan, the wound charm of the three good brothers who met Christ upon the road as they went to gather herbs, the little rhymes said over a fever, turn up in the court records of one age wearing almost exactly the shape they had worn in the manuscripts of a far earlier one. A charm a monk had copied in the 10th century was still being spoken, more or less unchanged, by a village healer brought before a court many centuries later, carried across all that time by nothing but memory and the passing of mouth to ear. To see the two laid side by side is to see the sheer endurance of this spoken medicine, older by far than any of the books that tried to hold it or to forbid it. There is no way to take the sorrow out of this, and we should not try. The knowledge was saved at a terrible cost to the one who held it, written down in her worst hour, in the worst of circumstances, by people who wished her only harm. It is not a comfortable kind of preservation, and it would be wrong to be glad of it in any simple way. And yet the knowledge itself is innocent of the manner of its saving, and the charm that comes down to us from a trial record is the same charm a loving mother once murmured over a feverish child, whatever grim page we now must read it on. The debt that scholars owe to these records is real, and a little uneasy. A great part of our knowledge of the folk charms of Europe, the very words and forms of the spoken medicine that was almost never written down by its own keepers, comes from the archives of prosecution, from the trials and the confessions and the pamphlets of condemnation. Without this hostile writing down, much of it would have vanished with the last healer, who knew it, unrecorded and unrecoverable. It is a strange gratitude, and one to be felt quietly, that we owe so much of this gentle knowledge to the least gentle chapter of its history. Let us end this part of our evening by turning the picture back toward the light, for it was never wholly dark. The same records that show us healers condemned show us many more acquitted, sent home, believed, or quietly protected by neighbors who would not testify against the woman who had brought their children into the world. The officials who tried such cases often consulted cunning folk themselves in private life. The line between the healer and the accused was real, but it was crossed far less often than the famous cases suggest. And for most of the cunning folk of Europe the charm and the herb remained all their lives, simply the way they helped their neighbors, blessed rather than cursed by nearly everyone who knew them. What all of this shows in the end is the sheer stubbornness of knowledge, its refusal to be unsaid. The church could soften the charm, the printer could drop it, the censor could ink it out, and still it survived, in the margin, in the household book, and even, when all else failed, in the mouth of its own accusers and the record of its own condemnation. Every attempt to erase it seems, somehow, to have written it down somewhere instead. It is a quiet and rather hopeful thought to carry with us as we move on, that a thing truly known by ordinary people is very nearly impossible to erase, because it lives in too many places at once, even in the places meant to end it. And when at last the anxious centuries passed, and calmer times came, there arose a new kind of person whose whole purpose was not to erase these scattered survivals, but to gather them on purpose and with love into safe keeping. They were the collectors, the antiquaries who rode the country in search of old books and saved what the ruin had spared. And it is to them and to the great libraries they built that we turn now. We come now to the turning of the tide, to the moment in our long story when the forces of forgetting began, at last, to give way to the forces of remembering. For after the great scatterings and the long suspicions, there arose in Europe a new kind of person, the collector, the antiquary, the lover of old things, whose whole delight was to seek out the surviving fragments of the past and gather them into safety. Where earlier ages had thrown the old books away, these men and women hunted them down and treasured them, and it is very largely to them that we owe the survival of what survives. They were a curious company, these collectors, gentlemen of leisure and learning, physicians with a passion for the past, scholars who spent their fortunes on manuscripts. They rode the country buying up old volumes from the families and churches and stalls that held them, rescuing from kitchen drawers and lumber rooms the very books that the dissolution had scattered a century or two before. What had been treated as waste by one age became the prized quarry of the next, and the loose leaves and orphaned herbals that had survived by pure chance were now sought out, paid for, and carefully preserved. One great gentleman of the early years gathered into his library a magnificent hoard of medieval manuscripts saved from the wreck of the monasteries. Among them some of the oldest and most precious books in the English tongue, the very Anglo-Saxon volumes in which the old plant medicine of the North was written down. Through him, and others like him, the Leechbooks and the charm collections we spoke of earlier passed from the danger of the open world into the shelter of a proper library, catalogued, guarded, and read. The books that had come so near to vanishing found, in these private collections, the first truly safe home they had known in centuries. And yet danger has a long reach, and it followed the books even here, in a way that reminds us how narrow every survival has been. The great collection of manuscripts we have just spoken of was housed, in the early 18th century, in a building that caught fire one autumn night, and before the flames could be beaten back a number of the rescued treasures were damaged or destroyed. Some of the most precious books in the whole of English literature bear, to this day, the scorch marks of that night, their edges browned and crumbling, saved only by the desperate labour of those who carried them out. A book might survive the breaking of the monasteries, survive 200 years of chance and change, and still very nearly burn at the last, in the safest place it had ever known. The scorched leaves that came through that fire are a strange and moving thing to see, and they carry a lesson we have met again and again tonight. Nothing is ever quite safe. Every old book that reaches us has come through not one narrow escape, but a whole long chain of them, each generation's fire and damp and neglect and simple bad luck. And its presence on the shelf today is less a matter, of course, than a small standing marvel. That we can read the old remedies at all is the sum of 1,000 near misses, and the singed pages of that library fire are only the most visible scars of a survival that was always, at every step, a very close thing. Other collectors gathered other kinds of book. One antiquary of a searching, curious mind made it his particular delight to save the manuscripts of alchemy and astrology and the star-reading medicine we spoke of earlier, the very books that lay under the deepest suspicion, and by gathering them he gave a safe home to a whole tradition that might otherwise have been lost to disapproval. His collection grew into a great museum and library that stands to this day, and within it the strange, suspect, star-haunted medicine of the past found not a censor but a keeper, preserved as a thing worth studying rather than a thing worth burning. Not every great collection had a happy history, and one in particular stands as a warning of how easily even a scholar's library could be lost. In the age before these safekeepings, one of the most learned men of his time had gathered at his house, beside the river, the largest private library in the land, some thousands of volumes on every branch of knowledge, with medicine and the plants and the stars well represented among them. But while he was away on a long journey abroad, his house was entered and his books were scattered and carried off, so that the labor of a lifetime was dispersed within a single season, and he came home to find his great library a wreck from which he never fully recovered. Much of it vanished for good, though later collectors, hunting patiently through the sales and stalls of the following century, traced and rescued a fair number of his books and gathered them back into safety. It is a reminder that a collection is only ever as safe as the care around it, and that the building of the great libraries was itself a fragile and hard-won thing. Greatest of all, perhaps, was a physician of enormous curiosity, who spent a long life gathering everything, books and manuscripts, dried plants and curiosities, remedies from every corner of the known world, until his collection had swelled beyond the compass of any private house. When he died, this vast hoard passed into the keeping of the nation and became the founding seed of one of the world's great museums and one of its greatest libraries. Among its countless treasures were herbals beyond number and medical manuscripts by the thousand, the plant knowledge of many centuries, and many lands gathered at last under one roof, open to any scholar who came to study it. In this passing of the great collections from private hands into public keeping lies the quiet triumph of our whole story. The old books had survived for 1,000 years by luck, by hiding, by clinging to something valued for another reason, by being copied faithfully by men who half distrusted them. Now, at last, they came into the care of institutions whose entire purpose was to keep them, to catalogue them, to guard them against fire and damp and time, and to make them available to be read. Survival by chance had become survival by design, and the endangered book had found, after so many centuries, a keeper who wanted nothing more than to see it safe. In time, several of these great private collections were drawn together into a single national keeping, joined under one roof and opened, at last, not to a favoured few, but to any who wished to come and read. The gathered books of the antiquary, the alchemist, and the physician, each hoard the labor of one lifetime, became together the founding treasure of a great public library, held now not for a family's pride, but for the common good and the use of all. The old plant books that had survived by hiding in bindings and clinging to margins now lay in ordered cases, catalogued and guarded and free to be consulted, as safe and as open as any knowledge in the world. The long journey from the secret shelf to the public reading room was complete. With safety came study, and this too was new. The antiquaries did not merely hoard the old medical books, they began to read them, to copy and compare, and eventually to print them, so that the Leechbooks and Herbals that had slept unread in monastic hands, and then in private cabinets, came into the light of scholarship. Men set themselves to understand the old plant medicine on its own terms, to trace its sources and untangle its charms, and in doing so they turned the forbidden and forgotten knowledge of the past into an object of patient, respectful learning. The very books that earlier ages had scoured their candlesticks with were now treated as treasures to be pored over line by line. We should not pretend that the danger ever wholly ended, for it did not. Fire, flood, war, and neglect have gone on threatening the world's old books down to our own day, and much has been lost even in recent times. But the balance had shifted, and shifted for good. For the first time in the whole long history we have followed tonight, the forces working to preserve the old plant knowledge were stronger than the forces working, by design or by carelessness, to erase it. The tide had turned toward remembering, and it has, on the whole, kept turning that way ever since. And once these old books lay safe upon their shelves, catalogued and studied and no longer in danger of the fire, something else became possible, something the monks who first copied them could never have imagined. They could be opened again and read with entirely new eyes, their ancient remedies carried out of the library and into the laboratory and tested gently and carefully to see what truth might still be living in them after all these centuries. It is to that reading of the old books by a new light that we turn now. Once the old books lay safe upon their shelves, catalogued and studied, and no longer in danger of the fire, a new and rather wonderful thing became possible. They could be read not only as curiosities of a vanished age, but as records of remedies that might, just might, still hold some truth. And so, in fairly recent times, scholars and scientists have begun, here and there, to take an old receipt down from the shelf, to make it up exactly as the manuscript directs, and to carry it into the laboratory to see, gently and carefully, what it actually does. It is a quiet and respectful kind of curiosity, and it has produced a few surprises worth an hour of our evening. The question these researchers ask is a modest one, not whether the old healers were secretly wise beyond their years, nor whether their whole science was sound, but simply this: among all the thousands of remedies they wrote down, are there any that truly work? And if so, can we now understand why? It is a fair question to put to a body of knowledge built on so many centuries of patient watching, and the answering of it has become, for a few careful minds, a real and fruitful study. We have already met, earlier tonight, the most famous answer to that question. It bears returning to now, told in full, for it stands at the very heart of this chapter. In the old Leechbook of the North, there is a salve for an infection of the eye, made of garlic and another plant of the onion kind, pounded together with wine and with the bile of an ox, and left to stand in a vessel of brass for 9 nights before it is strained and used. A group of scholars, working with a microbiologist, decided to make this salve up again exactly as the 1,000-year-old book directs, following every step: the 2 plants, the wine, the ox gall, the brass, the full 9 nights of waiting, changing nothing. And when they tested what they had made against one of the most stubborn and dangerous bacteria known to modern medicine, the salve killed it thoroughly, in a way that surprised everyone involved. The most telling part of the finding was this: it was not any single ingredient that did the work. Garlic alone did little. Wine alone did little. It was the whole recipe together, made just so and left the full time, that held the power, as though the old direction to combine exactly these things in exactly this way, which might have looked like mere fussiness, had captured something real that no single part could manage on its own. The exactness of the old healer, her insistence on this herb, and not that, this vessel and this number of nights, turned out not to be superstition at all, but a kind of remembered precision, the distilled result of long trial, telling her that the cure worked only when it was made in one particular way. Nor is the eyesalve alone. Consider the willow, whose bark the very oldest herbals, going back to Dioscorides himself, recommended for pain and for fever. For century upon century the healers gave it, not knowing why it helped, only that it did, and in fairly recent times the chemists took up that ancient hint, drew out the substance in the bark that eased the pain, refined it, and made from it one of the most widely used medicines in the whole modern world, swallowed today by countless people who have never heard the name of the tree it came from. The willow of the old herbals and the little tablet in the modern cabinet are, at root, the same remedy, separated only by the long labor of finding out why the bark had always worked. The same substance, as it happens, lies in the meadowsweet, that frothy, sweet-scented herb of the damp meadow that the old books praised for aches and fevers, and the modern medicine even carries. Folded into its name, a memory of the old plant that helped to give it. The gentle herb of the wet ditch and the potent drug of the pharmacy turn out to be cousins, and the country healer who reached for meadowsweet on an aching morning was reaching, without knowing it, for the same relief a modern person finds in a bottle from the chemist. Or think of honey, which the oldest wound receipts of every ancient people laid thick upon a cut or a burn to help it heal clean. For a long stretch of modern times, this was dismissed as an old wives' notion, a sticky superstition with nothing behind it. And then, quite recently, the notion was looked at again with proper care, and honey was found to hold a real power against the germs that trouble a wound, so that today it is used once more, in a purified and careful form, in hospitals, laid upon stubborn wounds that will not otherwise heal. The oldest wound dressing in the world, dropped and forgotten, has returned to the very places that once knew better than to use it. Garlic, too, that most humble and most universal of the old healing plants, praised in every herbal from the most ancient onward, as a guard against infection and contagion, has yielded up at least a part of its secret to modern study, which finds in it a substance that does indeed trouble the germs it was always thought to fight. The cottage remedy hung in the kitchen against every ill, and the careful modern finding meet in the same small pungent clove, and the long faith of the Herbals turns out to have rested on something after all. Perhaps the most famous bridge of all, from the cottage to the pharmacy, is the foxglove. In an English county, it was said, there lived an old woman who kept a family remedy for the dropsy, that painful swelling of the body, a secret brew of many herbs that she gave with real success. A physician of a curious and honest mind heard of her cures, sought out her recipe, and worked patiently through its many ingredients, until he found that the true power lay in one alone, the purple foxglove of the hedgerow. He studied it with great care, learned its right and careful dose, for it is a strong and dangerous plant, and set down his findings in a small book that turned a wise woman's country secret into a measured medicine for the failing heart, one still in use, in refined form, to this day. Here the whole of our evening is caught in a single story, the folk remedy and the learned physician meeting at last, and the humble hedgerow plant passing quietly from the cottage into the canon of medicine. We must be honest, though, and honesty here means balance. For every old remedy that has proved to hold some truth, there were a great many that held none at all, and some that did real harm. The old medicine bled its patients and purged them, gave them things we now know to be poisons, and leaned on a great deal of belief that no laboratory will ever confirm. It would be a foolish romance to imagine that the healers of the past were secretly right about everything, or that their every charm hid a modern truth. Most did not. The picture is a mixed one, as all honest pictures are, a long patient watching that found, here and there, amid much that was useless, a few things that were real. And that, in the end, is the right and gentle way to hold all of this. The old healers were not hidden scientists, and their knowledge was not a lost technology waiting to be recovered whole. They were patient watchers of the world, working by trial and memory across uncounted generations, and such patient watching, carried on long enough by enough people, will now and then stumble upon something true and hold on to it without ever quite knowing why. The laboratory does not prove the old healers wise. It simply reads their long record with a finer eye and tells us, at last, which of the things they noticed were real. It is less a triumph of the new over the old than a quiet conversation between them. The wise woman and the chemist bent over the same green leaf, separated by centuries, agreeing at last on what it can do. There is a lovely modesty in the scientists who do this work, the ones who go to the old books not to mock them, but to learn from them, treating a 1,000-year-old receipt as a hypothesis worth testing, rather than a quaint mistake worth dismissing. They know that the old healers watched the sick for far longer than any modern trial has run, and that a remedy trusted across 1,000 years has, at the very least, earned a careful second look. In their patient reopening of the old manuscripts, the whole long story of forbidden and forgotten plant medicine comes round to a kind of rest. The endangered books not merely saved now, but honoured, read, and, here and there, found to be right. And yet, for all the safety of the libraries and all the care of the laboratories, the deepest survival of this knowledge was never in any book at all, nor in any test that a scientist could run. It lived, and lives still, in the common memory of ordinary people, in the names they gave their plants, and the customs they kept, and the small sayings they passed to their children. In a great unwritten library that no fire could ever reach and no censer could ever find. It is to that last and most stubborn survival that we turn now, as our evening draws toward its close. For all the books we have followed tonight, saved and lost, hidden and burned and rescued, the truest survival of the old plant knowledge was never really a matter of books at all. It lived, more deeply than in any manuscript, in the memory of ordinary people, carried in their heads and their hands and their daily speech, and it is this living memory, more than any library, that carried the knowledge whole across every upheaval we have described. You cannot burn a memory. You cannot place a spoken rhyme upon an index, and so the part of this knowledge that lived in the common mind proved, in the end, the hardest of all to erase. Think only of the names. The plants of the hedgerow still carry, in the ordinary names we give them, the whole of their old use folded quietly inside. We call one plant woundwort, and in the very name is the memory that it was laid upon wounds. We call another self-heal, and another all-heal, and another fever-few, the driver out of fevers, and another eye-bright for the troubled eye, and another lungwort for the labouring chest, and another bond-set or knit-bone for the broken limb it was thought to mend. Every one of these names is a tiny remedy book in itself, a use remembered in a single word, and a child who learns to call the plant by its name learns, without any page at all, what the plant was for. This is how the knowledge travelled through the ages when the books were scarce or forbidden or burned. It travelled in the names, and in the customs, and in the small spoken sayings that cost nothing to keep and asked no library to hold them. The gathering of certain herbs at midsummer, the little courtesy shown to the elder tree, the blessing murmured over a cut, the rhyme that told which berry was safe and which was not, all of these lived in the doing and the saying, handed from the old to the young in the ordinary course of a life, entirely beyond the reach of anyone who might have wished to stop them. The old sayings themselves were a kind of medicine chest that folded up small enough to carry in the head. Country speech was full of little rhymes and proverbs about the plants, telling when to eat which herb and why, promising long life to the one who took sage in May, praising the leek and the wholesome pot herb, warning which berry of the hedge was kind and which was cruel. These scraps of verse cost nothing to keep and asked no book to hold them, and they carried, in a form a child could learn in an afternoon, the settled wisdom of many lifetimes about what the garden and the hedgerow could do. A whole practical botany lived in these sayings, passed at the fireside and in the field, and no authority on earth could have gathered them all up to burn them, for they were everywhere and nowhere, on every tongue, and in no single book. And in time, the guarded knowledge of the learned was deliberately handed down to the common people as well, by those who thought it wrong to keep it locked away. In the middle years of the 17th century, an English herbalist set himself to break the long monopoly of the physicians, who kept their knowledge in Latin and their remedies dear, by translating their guarded pharmacopoeia into plain English and writing a cheap herbal that any labouring family could buy and read. The learned men despised him for it, and worse. But his book went into edition after edition, and stayed in print for centuries, carrying the once private knowledge of the plants into countless ordinary homes. Here the deliberate opening of a closed door did what all the accidents of survival had done before, only on purpose, setting the old plant knowledge free among the very people who most needed it. And so the great unbroken chain we spoke of long ago, the mother teaching the daughter, the aunt teaching the niece, the old healer teaching the girl who carried her basket, turns out to have been the strongest thread in the whole story. Institutions were broken, libraries scattered, printers watched, healers tried, and still the knowledge passed quietly down that living chain, from hand to hand and mouth to ear, needing no permission and leaving no trace that any authority could seize. It was too dispersed to destroy. It lived in too many minds and too many gardens at once, and to erase it truly one would have had to erase the people themselves, which no one, in the end, could do. The figure of the healer herself endured in the same way, worn down to the homely shape of the grandmother, who always knew a cure. Long after the wise woman and the cunning man had faded from the parish, there was still, in almost every family, someone old who knew that a warm infusion of one herb would settle a troubled stomach, that another laid on a sting would draw out the heat, that honey and a certain flower would ease a winter cough. These were not thought of as medicine at all, only as the ordinary knowledge of a household, the small remedies a mother reached for before ever a doctor was called. Yet they were the last living leaves of the very tree we have followed all evening, the plain plant knowledge of ordinary people, handed down so quietly and so constantly that no one even noticed they were keeping alive a thing that kings and councils and great fires had all, in their turn, failed to erase. That living thread reaches all the way to us. The herbs the old healers trusted are still in our gardens and our kitchens, in the mint and the sage and the rosemary on the sill, in the chamomile and the lavender we still reach for at the end of a long day. Their old names are still on our lips. Their ancient remedies still stand, in refined and studied form, in the medicines we take without a thought. The knowledge that so many hands tried to hold, and so many books tried to keep, and so many fires tried to end, is not lost at all. It flows on quietly all around us, so woven into ordinary life that we scarcely notice it is there, the last and truest survival of everything we have followed tonight. It helps, at the close, to see the written and the living memory as two libraries that between them lost almost nothing. The written record kept the precise, the exact receipt, the careful measure, the plant named in Latin and drawn true, the very words of a charm frozen on the page. The living memory kept the essential, the plain knowledge of what a plant was for, carried in a name and a custom and a rhyme, indifferent to exact measure but impossible to burn. When fire or censer took the written record, the living memory carried the knowledge on until it could be written again. When a chain of teaching broke and the living memory failed, the old written record was there to be reopened and read. Each saved what the other let fall, and between the two of them, across all the long centuries of loss, the green knowledge of the plants came down to us very nearly whole. You can see both libraries still, if you look. The written one survives in the great collections, the Herbals and Leechbooks safe now behind glass, read and studied and honored. The living one survives in the gardens, in the physic beds that gardeners still plant in the old monastic pattern, in the cottage borders where the same faithful herbs still grow by the door as grew there 500 years ago, in the botanic gardens where the healing plants of the world are gathered and kept alive. The one library is made of ink and skin and paper. The other is made of soil and root and leaf, and the quiet knowledge of the hands that tend them. Both came through the long dark, and both are here tonight, and neither, in the end, was ever truly erased. Perhaps that is the gentlest thought on which to gather up our whole long evening. The books mattered, and their saving mattered, and it is right to honor the copyists and the collectors and the patient scholars who kept them. But beneath the books, all along, ran this deeper and more durable thing, the plain human memory of what the plants could do, held not in ink on skin, but in the living minds of ordinary people, and handed down among them so quietly, so constantly, that it was never truly in anyone's power to erase. The forbidden herbals were nearly lost 100 times over. The knowledge inside them was never really in danger of dying at all. We have wandered a very long way tonight from the pagan books the Christian world inherited and gently baptized, through the charms it tried to soften, and the Leechbooks that kept the old words inside Christian covers, through the monks who saved what they doubted, and the women whose knowledge was never allowed onto the page, through the remedies hidden in the margins and the printed books of secrets, through Paracelsus and his burning of the old masters, through the great list of forbidden books and the breaking of the monastic libraries, through the household receipt book and the charm saved by the court that condemned it, through the collectors and their scorched, rescued treasures, to the laboratory that read the oldest cures again, and at last to the living memory that no fire could reach. It has been a long journey, and a quiet one, and there is nothing at all left to remember of it. The candle on the shelf beside us has burned down now to its last patient inch, and the great dark room of books has settled fully into stillness around us. Every volume we have taken down and turned over tonight is back upon its shelf, safe in the keeping of a world that has finally learned to treasure it, and there is nothing left to save and nothing left to do. There is no need to remember any of this. If your eyes close somewhere along the way, among the monks or the margins, or the quiet story of the foxglove, that was always exactly the point of the evening, and you have missed nothing at all that will not keep until another night. Let the whole of it settle now into the dark alongside you, the burned books and the saved ones, the charms and the receipts, the wise women and the monks and the patient collectors, all of them at rest at last, their long work of remembering done for tonight. Let your shoulders soften and your breathing slow, and let every small thought of the day drift away into the same gentle dark that has closed over all those old and endangered books which are safe now and asking nothing of you, as you are safe and need do nothing at all. Sleep well. The quiet apothecary will be back soon with another quiet chapter. The candle is nearly out now, and the long shelves of old books have faded from sight, and there is only the soft dark and the last thread of smoke rising unseen toward the rafters. Rest now. The whole quiet library keeps watch, and the night is entirely your own. Good night.